Before any city rose from its banks, the river that would become the Thames was a powerful geological force, its course shifting dramatically with the advance and retreat of Pleistocene ice sheets. In the warmer interglacial periods, this broad, slow-moving river valley became a rich hunting ground for early hominids. Dating back approximately 400,000 years, the remains of Homo heidelbergensis were found alongside Clactonian flint tools and the fossilized bones of extinct megafauna, including straight-tusked elephants, woolly mammoths, and giant deer, providing a clear snapshot of a Paleolithic ecosystem. As the last glacial maximum receded around 12,000 years ago, Mesolithic hunter-gatherer populations re-established themselves in the region. Their presence is attested not by grand monuments, but by the subtle yet persistent scatter of their material culture. Excavations in Uxbridge have uncovered the remains of what is considered the oldest house in London, a small circular shelter dating to around 8,500 BCE, its post holes hinting at a temporary dwelling used by a mobile community. Thousands of their characteristic flint tools, known as microliths, have been recovered from the river's tributaries, the Wandle and the Lear, indicating the locations of seasonal camps where these groups processed food, prepared hides, and fashioned their essential equipment for survival. The arrival of the Neolithic period, around 4,500 BCE, brought fundamental changes to the landscape and its inhabitants. The introduction of agriculture led to the systematic clearing of the wildwood that once dominated the valley. Polished stone axes, many dredged from the Thames itself, are the tangible evidence of this immense deforestation effort. While no major settlements from this period have been found in the immediate marshy area of what would become the City of London, significant ritual landscapes were established in the wider Thames Valley. The Stanwell Cursus, a massive earthen monument stretching for nearly 4 kilometers, suggests a sophisticated level of social organization and a shared belief system capable of mobilizing substantial communal labor for non-utilitarian purposes. The Bronze Age, beginning around 2500 BCE, transformed the river into a central artery for trade and a site of intense ritual activity. An extraordinary quantity of high-status metalwork has been systematically recovered from the Thames foreshore, including hundreds of bronze swords, daggers, and spearheads. The pristine condition of these items suggests they were not lost accidentally, but were deliberately deposited as votive offerings to the river's powerful deities. Just a quick announcement: if you enjoy this video so far, please subscribe to our channel, as it motivates us to bring you a new story every evening. This is the only kind request tonight, and we won't bother you with it anymore until the very end of today's story. Let's get back to the video. The discovery of the Battersea Shield, an intricately decorated ceremonial shield clearly not intended for combat, confirms the river's sacred function. Furthermore, the remains of a massive wooden bridge at Vauxhall, carbon dated to between 1750 and 1285 BCE, provide the first definitive proof of a permanent crossing point, indicating a highly organized society with established trade routes and territorial claims. The subsequent Iron Age saw the rise of distinct Celtic tribal groups who established fortified settlements or oppida on higher ground surrounding the valley, setting the final prehistoric stage before the arrival of the Roman legions. The Roman conquest of Britain, initiated under Emperor Claudius in 43 CE, was a systematic military and administrative undertaking that required the establishment of a strategic supply base. The location chosen was not a pre-existing tribal capital, but a calculated selection based on logistical necessity. Roman military engineers identified a point on the Thames, approximately 30 miles from the estuary, where the river was narrow enough to construct a bridge, yet deep enough to allow sea-going merchant vessels to dock. This site, situated on 2 small gravel hills rising above the surrounding marshland, offered dry, defensible ground. The area was previously unoccupied, a deliberate choice that allowed for the creation of an entirely new settlement without the complexities of adapting a native British centre. The establishment of this outpost, which would become Londinium, occurred within a few years of the invasion, with archaeological evidence suggesting a foundation date around 47 CE. The settlement's primary function was logistical and commercial from its inception. Its existence was predicated on the construction of the first timber bridge, a massive engineering project whose pilings, dated through dendrochronology, anchored the new town to the Roman road network being laid across the province. Londinium was not founded as a legionary fortress, a castrum, but developed organically as a civilian town, or vicus, populated by merchants, craftsmen, and administrators who followed in the wake of the legions. Its population was immediately cosmopolitan, with evidence of settlers from Gaul, the Rhineland, and the Mediterranean. The name itself, Londinium, is of pre-Roman origin, likely a Latinized version of a local Celtic place name. While its precise etymology is debated, leading theories suggest it derives from a personal name, Londinos, meaning the bold one, or a topographical term describing the wild, untamed nature of the place. The Roman adoption of a native name was a common practice, integrating the new foundation into the existing cultural landscape. The initial layout of the settlement followed a planned grid pattern, a hallmark of Roman urbanism, with timber-framed buildings and gravel streets. Its rapid growth was fueled by its strategic position at the hub of the new provincial road system and its function as a port. The discovery of the Bloomberg tablets, a remarkable collection of over 400 wooden writing tablets preserved in the wet soil of the Walbrook stream, provides direct evidence of this early activity. Dating from the 50s to the 80s CE, these documents represent the earliest written records from Britain, containing business contracts, financial accounts, and legal correspondence. One tablet, dated to 57 CE, includes the first known reference to the city, addressed simply Londinio, confirming its status as a bustling centre of commerce and administration less than a decade after its founding. This rapid development from a strategic river crossing into a vital economic hub established the foundations of a city that would soon become the capital of the Roman province of Britannia. The rapid prosperity of Londinium was violently interrupted in 60 or 61 CE by a catastrophic rebellion that annihilated the nascent city. The catalyst for the uprising was the death of Prasutagus, the client king of the Iceni tribe in modern-day East Anglia. In his will, Prasutagus had named the Roman emperor as co-heir alongside his two daughters, a political maneuver intended to preserve his kingdom's autonomy. Roman officials, however, ignored the will, annexed the kingdom, flogged his widow Boudica, and subjected their daughters to rape. This brutal assertion of dominance, combined with the seizure of Iceni noble lands and the calling in of loans by Roman financiers, ignited a furious backlash. The Iceni found ready allies in the neighbouring Trinovantes, who harboured deep grievances over the confiscation of their land for the establishment of a Roman veteran colony at Camulodunum, Colchester. Londinium, alongside Camulodunum and Verulamium St. Albans, was a primary target for the rebel army. These were not fortified military garrisons but sprawling, undefended centres of commerce and Roman administration, symbols of the new occupying power. The provincial governor, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, was campaigning with the bulk of his legions far to the west, suppressing the Druidic stronghold on the island of Mona, Anglesey, leaving the southeastern settlements dangerously exposed. After sacking Camulodunum, Boudica's tribal coalition, numbering in the tens of thousands, advanced on Londinium. Suetonius, racing back from his campaign, reached the city ahead of the rebels, but quickly determined that his limited forces were insufficient to defend the sprawling, unwalled settlement. He made the ruthless strategic decision to abandon Londinium to its fate, sacrificing the city to preserve his army for a decisive field battle. The historical account by Tacitus describes a merciless slaughter of the inhabitants who remained. Archaeological excavations have provided stark, physical corroboration of this event. Across the site of the early Roman city, A distinct stratum known as the Boudiccan destruction layer is consistently found. This thick, reddish-black layer of burnt debris, up to half a meter deep in places, contains charred building timbers, melted glass, and shattered pottery, evidence of a city systematically put to the torch. The intensity of the fire, estimated to have reached over 10 degrees Celsius, vitrified clay and warped metal, sealing a moment of utter devastation in the geological record. After destroying Londinium and subsequently Verulamium, Boudicca's forces were finally confronted and defeated by Suetonius Paulinus's legions. The immediate aftermath left Londinium a smouldering ruin, its brief 13-year history erased by fire. Yet this obliteration proved to be a critical turning point. The Romans immediately began the process of rebuilding, laying out a new, more ambitious city on the ashes of the old. This reconstruction allowed for more substantial infrastructure and grander public buildings, setting the stage for Londinium's rebirth not just as a commercial hub, but as the administrative and political heart of Roman Britannia. In the decades following its reconstruction, Londinium's strategic and commercial importance translated into political reality as it systematically replaced Camulodunum as the administrative centre of Roman Britannia. This elevated status was physically manifested in an ambitious program of public building. Around 85 CE, during the Flavian dynasty, the city's first monumental forum and basilica complex was completed. This vast stone structure, occupying a central position in the city grid, served as the integrated heart of civic life. The forum was an open-air piazza lined with colonnades and shops, where merchants conducted business and the public gathered. Adjoining it was the basilica, a massive rectangular hall that functioned as the city's primary administrative and legal building. It housed the law courts, the treasury, and the offices of the provincial procurator, making it the tangible seat of Roman imperial authority in the province. This first iteration of Londinium's civic centre was largely destroyed by a second major catastrophe, the so-called Hadrianic Fire, a widespread conflagration around 125 CE. While its cause is unknown, its archaeological footprint is a distinct layer of burnt material that provides a clear chronological marker. Far from signalling decline, this destruction prompted an even more grandiose phase of rebuilding. On the site of the old complex, work began on a new forum and basilica of unprecedented scale. Completed by about 140 CE, this second complex was one of the largest in the entire northern Roman Empire, rivaling those in major Gallic cities. The basilica alone stretched over 165 meters in length, its nave soaring to a height of approximately 30 meters, a clear and unambiguous statement of Londinium's wealth and preeminent status within the province. Beyond the administrative core, other structures catered to the cultural and social life of a major Roman city. Around 70 CE, a wooden amphitheatre was constructed just outside the main settlement area, a site now located beneath Guildhall Yard. This venue hosted gladiatorial combats, wild beast hunts, and public executions for a populace demanding Roman-style entertainment. In the early 12th century, this initial structure was replaced by a more substantial stone and timber amphitheatre, with masonry walls and an elliptical arena, capable of holding an estimated 6,000 to 8,000 spectators. The discovery of its foundations in 1988 confirmed the presence of this key public building. Further solidifying its capital status was the construction of a vast governor's palace on the north bank of the river, near modern-day Cannon Street. This sprawling complex, equipped with gardens and ornamental pools, provided the official residence and administrative headquarters for the emperor's highest-ranking representative in Britain, cementing Londinium's role as the political, legal, and social nexus of the province. For more than a century after its post-Hadrianic rebuilding, Londinium thrived as a largely open city, its security guaranteed not by static defences, but by the projection of Roman military power across the province. This sense of security was shattered toward the end of the 12th century. growing political instability across the empire, culminating in the civil wars following the assassination of Emperor Commodus, had direct consequences for Britannia. In 196 CE, the governor of Britain, Clodius Albinus, stripped the province of its legions in a failed attempt to claim the imperial throne, leaving the northern frontier dangerously exposed to incursions from Pictish tribes. This new era of uncertainty prompted the most ambitious engineering project in Londinium's history: the construction of a massive defensive wall. Erected between 190 and 225 CE, the landward wall was a monumental undertaking. The structure stretched for approximately 2 miles, enclosing the city on its northern, eastern, and western sides, while the Thames provided a natural defence to the south. It encompassed an area of around 330 acres, formally defining the city's physical boundaries. The construction required an immense logistical operation, involving the quarrying and transport of over 85 0 tons of Kentish ragstone, a durable limestone brought by barge up the Thames from quarries near modern-day Maidstone. This imported stone formed the wall's outer facing, while the core was composed of local rubble and bonded with distinctive courses of red ceramic tiles. Standing approximately 6 meters high and 2.5 meters thick at its base, the wall was fronted by a deep V-shaped ditch, or fossa, further enhancing its defensive capabilities. This fortification was not merely a barrier but a complex military system. Internal turrets were constructed at regular intervals along its length, providing elevated platforms for sentries and artillery. The city's major arterial roads passed through a series of fortified gateways, including Ludgate, Newgate, Aldersgate, Cripplegate, Bishopsgate, and Aldgate, which served as controlled entry points for people and goods. The project also integrated an existing military fort at Cripplegate, built decades earlier, incorporating its northern and western walls into the new city-wide circuit. The construction of the London Wall was more than a pragmatic defensive measure. It was a profound statement of prestige and permanence. It visibly transformed the provincial capital into a fortified stronghold, the administrative heart of a frontier province now secured behind stone. This wall would define the physical footprint of the City of London for the next 500 years, its course dictating the city's medieval layout long after the empire that built it had vanished. Beneath the public grandeur of its forums and basilicas, Roman Londinium hosted a rich and diverse religious life that included numerous private cults imported from across the empire. Among the most significant of these was the mystery religion dedicated to the god Mithras. Originating in Persia but heavily adapted for a Roman audience, Mithraism was an exclusive, all-male cult, particularly popular with soldiers, merchants, and imperial officials, the very demographics that formed the backbone of Londinium's administrative and commercial elite. Its appeal lay in its hierarchical structure of initiation, its promise of salvation, and the strong bonds of fraternity forged through secret rituals. Worship took place in subterranean temples, or mithraea, designed to replicate the cave in which the god performed his primary feat. In 1954, during construction work on a new office building in the Walbrook Valley, archaeologists uncovered the remarkably preserved remains of Londinium's Mithraeum. The temple, originally constructed around 240 CE, was a small basilica-style building with a central nave and raised side aisles, built partially underground to create a dark, cavernous atmosphere. Initiates would have reclined on the side benches to participate in ritual feasts, a central component of Mithraic worship. The discovery yielded an extraordinary collection of high-quality marble sculptures, deliberately buried in the 4th century, likely by the cult's last followers to protect them from Christian iconoclasts. Among these were heads of the gods Serapis and Minerva, indicating a syncretic tolerance for other deities. But the most important find was the tauroctony. This iconic scene, the centerpiece of every Mithraeum, depicts Mithras, identifiable by his Phrygian cap, slaying a sacred bull. This act was not one of mere violence, but was believed to be a creative sacrifice that brought forth life and cosmic order. From the bull's blood and body, life-giving plants and animals were thought to emerge, a foundational myth that offered initiates a path to rebirth and salvation. The cult involved a complex system of 7 grades of initiation, each linked to a celestial body: Corax, Raven, Mercury, Nymphus, Bride, Venus, Miles, Soldier, Mars, Leo, Lion, Jupiter, Persis, Persian, Moon, Heliodromus, Sunrunner, Sun, and finally Pater, Father, Saturn. Progression through these ranks involved specific trials and ceremonies, binding the members together in a secretive and loyal brotherhood. The eventual decline of Mithraism was a direct result of the rise of Christianity, which, after becoming the state religion, actively suppressed such pagan practices, forcing the final adherents of the Mithraic mysteries to hide their sacred icons beneath the city floor. The late 3rd century marked the beginning of Londinium's slow, complex decline, a process driven by crises that afflicted the entire Roman Empire. Economic turmoil, marked by rampant inflation and the debasement of currency, disrupted the long-distance trade networks that were the city's lifeblood. This instability was compounded by political upheaval, most notably the Carausian Revolt of 286 CE. The naval commander Carausius declared himself emperor of a breakaway state in Britain and northern Gaul, briefly making Londinium the capital of a renegade empire. This period of illicit prominence ended in 296 CE, when the legitimate Caesar, Constantius Chlorus, reconquered the province, his forces storming the city to defeat the usurper's remnants. In the aftermath, Diocletian's sweeping administrative reforms subdivided Britannia into smaller provinces, and while Londinium became the capital of Maxima Caesariensis, it now presided over a reduced territory. The 4th century brought further shocks. In 367 CE, a coordinated barbarian assault known as the Great Conspiracy saw Picts, Scoti, and Saxons overwhelm much of the province. While Londinium's fortifications likely held, the event shattered the sense of provincial security. The city subsequently served as the base from which Count Theodosius launched his campaign to restore order, a testament to its enduring strategic importance. Yet, the archaeological record reveals a city in terminal decline. No new monumental public buildings were erected after the mid-3rd century. Instead, evidence shows the Grand Forum and Basilica falling into disrepair, their structures repurposed or quarried for stone. Across the once thriving urban landscape, layers of dark, humic soil began to accumulate, indicating that large areas within the walls were being abandoned and converted into gardens, pasture, or waste ground. The city's economic vitality withered. The latest Roman coins become increasingly scarce in archaeological contexts after 402 CE, signaling the collapse of the monetary economy and the cessation of official payments to the military and civil administration. The final imperial break was not a singular event, but a gradual process of military withdrawal, as successive usurpers like Magnus Maximus in 383 and Constantine III in 407 stripped Britain of its troops for continental civil wars. The definitive end came around 410 CE, when Emperor Honorius, embroiled in the defence of Italy, responded to a British appeal for aid by advising the local civic authorities to arrange for their own defence. With the severance of imperial administration, tax collection and military support, the rationale for Londinium's existence evaporated. By 450 CE, the walled city was effectively a ghost town, its grand Roman structures empty and crumbling, a silent monument to a faded empire. For nearly 2 centuries after the final Roman departure, the walled enclosure of Londinium lay largely derelict, a ruined field of stone and tile that the newly settled Anglo-Saxons avoided. The rebirth of London occurred not within these decaying fortifications, but approximately a mile to the west, along the northern bank of the Thames. Here, beginning in the early 7th century, a new and vibrant settlement emerged, known as Londonwick. This Saxon port was fundamentally different from its Roman predecessor, It was not a centre of imperial administration, but a sprawling, undefended commercial emporium. Its layout, uncovered by extensive archaeological work in the areas of modern Covent Garden and the Strand, consisted of a planned grid of gravel streets lined with timber-framed buildings, workshops, and waterfront properties, covering at least 150 acres. Londonwick's existence was predicated entirely on international trade. It quickly became one of Northern Europe's most important mercantile hubs, a key node in the trade networks connecting Anglo-Saxon England with Francia, the Rhineland, and Scandinavia. Frisian and Frankish merchants were common sights along its bustling waterfront, their ships moored on the river's foreshore. Excavations have revealed the material evidence of this commerce in vast quantities. The primary exports were quintessentially English resources: raw wool, hides, and textiles, alongside more grim commodities such as enslaved people captured in regional wars. In return, Londonwich imported the luxuries of the continent. Vast amounts of Rhineland pottery, particularly Badorf-ware pitchers, have been unearthed, alongside fine glass vessels from Francia and durable quernstones from German quarries, essential for grinding grain. This resurgence of long-distance commerce necessitated a new monetary system. The barter economy of the immediate post-Roman centuries gave way to the minting of silver coins, known as sciatas. Tens of thousands of these small, thick coins have been discovered within the footprint of Londonwick, attesting to the sheer volume of transactions that defined its daily life. Politically, the port was a strategic prize. By the 8th century, it had fallen under the control of the powerful kingdom of Mercia, whose kings, like Offa, recognized its immense value as a source of revenue and a gateway for continental goods and influence. This new Saxon London, a bustling, outward-looking town of merchants and craftsmen, stood in stark contrast to the silent Roman ghost city to its east, defining a new economic and cultural identity for the region. The commercial prosperity of Londonwich, with its bustling waterfront and stores of continental goods, made it an exceptionally rich and vulnerable target for a new maritime threat emerging from Scandinavia. The first Viking raids on England in the late 8th century were swift coastal assaults, but by the 840s and 850s, their longships were penetrating deep into the river systems. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that in 842 there was great slaughter in London, and again in 851 a fleet of 350 ships stormed the port, putting the Mercian army to flight. These attacks, though destructive, were precursors to a far more existential threat. In 865, the Great Heathen Army, a formidable coalition of Scandinavian warbands, landed in East Anglia. This was not a raiding party but an invasion force intent on conquest and settlement, and it systematically dismantled the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms over the next decade. After years of campaigning across Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia, the Great Army turned its attention fully to the south. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that in the winter of 871, the Vikings established a winter camp within London itself. This was a strategic occupation, not a brief raid. They commandeered the settlement to serve as a secure, well-provisioned base from which to extort tribute and plan their next campaign against Wessex. The presence of this large occupying force effectively paralysed Londonwick's commercial functions. Foreign merchants ceased to arrive, and local production ground to a halt. Archaeological evidence from the Covent Garden area confirms this sudden and catastrophic disruption. The dense layers of refuse, discarded tools, and lost coins that characterise Londonwick's vibrant commercial period come to an abrupt end around this date. Instead, a sterile layer of soil indicates widespread abandonment. The undefended, sprawling nature of the Saxon port, once its greatest commercial advantage, now proved to be its fatal weakness. The Viking occupation effectively extinguished Londonwick, forcing its population to flee and shattering the economic networks that had sustained it for over 2 centuries. The Great Army's presence marked the definitive end of the Saxon trading emporium, rendering it an unsafe ghost town and forcing a fundamental strategic re-evaluation for the future of London. The abandonment of Londonwick following the Viking occupation of 871 created a strategic vacuum on the Thames. The West Saxon king, Alfred the Great, having secured his kingdom through a hard-won victory over the Danes at Edington in 878, recognised that a defensible London was essential for the long-term security of southern England. As part of his wider national defence strategy, which involved the creation of a network of fortified towns known as burhs, Alfred turned his attention to the derelict site on the Thames. In a pivotal act recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Alfred occupied London in 886. His plan was not to resurrect the vulnerable, sprawling emporium of Londonwick, but to implement a radical strategic shift. He moved the focus of settlement back to the east, reoccupying the 1 square mile area enclosed by the ancient Roman walls. This was a deliberate and planned urban refoundation. The Roman fortifications, though neglected for 4 centuries, still offered a formidable defensive perimeter. Alfred's engineers and workforces set about repairing the crumbling ramparts, clearing the gates, and likely redigging the defensive ditches. Within this secure enclosure, a new city, Londonburh, was laid out. This was not a restoration of the old Roman street grid, which had long been buried and forgotten. Instead, archaeological evidence reveals a new Anglo-Saxon plan, with a main high street running from east to west, and a network of smaller properties and lanes oriented towards the riverfront and the main gates. A key part of this revitalization was the establishment of a new commercial waterfront. Alfred's administration planned and constructed a new public wharf at Athelred's Hythe, later known as Queen Hythe, creating a secure, regulated harbour to attract trade back to the city. To ensure its viability, Alfred actively encouraged resettlement, offering plots of land and protection to those willing to move within the walls. This repopulation was essential, as the burh system relied on local garrisons drawn from the town's inhabitants to defend the fortifications. Politically, Alfred acted with shrewd diplomacy. Recognizing London's historical ties to Mercia, he placed the restored city under the authority of his son-in-law and trusted ally, Ealdorman Ethelred of Mercia. This act integrated Londonburh into a unified defence system for southern England, securing a vital strategic and economic asset. A mint was soon established, producing silver pennies that proclaimed Alfred's authority over this new, fortified heart of England. The restoration of 886 was the true foundation of medieval London, a planned military and commercial centre whose location and defensive character would define it for the next 1,000 years. Following Alfred's strategic refoundation, Londonburh entered a period of sustained growth throughout the 10th century, rapidly evolving into the preeminent urban centre of the newly forged Kingdom of England. Its dual identity as a formidable military stronghold and a burgeoning commercial hub attracted a diverse population of merchants, craftsmen, and administrators. The city's internal landscape filled in steadily. The planned street grid became a dense network of timber-framed houses, workshops, and parish churches, all contained within the security of the Roman walls. This planned growth was not haphazard, but was overseen by royal officials who managed the allocation of property and the maintenance of public spaces, ensuring the city functioned as an organized and defensible metropolis. The economic heart of Londonburh pulsed along its waterfront and its main market thoroughfare. The initial development at Queen Hythe was soon supplemented by a second major wharf to the east at Billingsgate, which became a bustling centre for handling bulk commodities like fish, timber, and grain. Inland, the main east-west artery became known as Cheapside, derived from the Old English sheep for market, cementing its role as the city's primary commercial spine. Excavations here have revealed the remains of numerous specialized workshops for leather workers, metal workers, and weavers, indicating a sophisticated craft-based economy. The Royal Mint expanded its operations significantly, becoming one of the most important in the kingdom, its silver pennies serving as a stable currency that facilitated the city's expanding trade. Politically, Londonburgh's status grew in tandem with its economic power. While Winchester remained the traditional capital of Wessex, London became an increasingly important royal centre. Kings like Athelstan and Edgar frequently held their royal councils, or witan, within the city, issuing laws and charters that underscored its national significance. The governance of the city itself became more formalised. A royally appointed official, the portreeve, supervised its trade and administered justice, while the city began to be subdivided into administrative wards, each headed by an alderman responsible for local defence and order a foundational system of civic government. The Saxon Cathedral of St. Paul was rebuilt and richly endowed, becoming a major ecclesiastical power. This combination of commercial wealth, political influence, and formidable defences made Londonderry the true heart of the English kingdom, a status it would prove during the trials of the next century. The renewed Danish invasions at the turn of the 11th century, led by Sweyn Forkbeard, shattered the relative stability of late Saxon England. While much of the kingdom capitulated under the pressure, Londonderry distinguished itself through its staunch and effective resistance, its formidable walls and citizen militia repelling multiple sieges. This resilience solidified its reputation as the kingdom's principal fortress. Following the deaths of both Sweyn and the English king Athelred the Unready, it was Sweyn's son, Knut, who methodically completed the Danish conquest. After a final, grueling siege of London and a campaign against Athelred's heir, Edmund Ironside, a treaty was agreed in 1016 that partitioned the kingdom. Upon Edmund's death shortly after, Knut the Great became the undisputed king of all England. Under Knut's rule, London's status underwent a profound transformation. The city became the effective capital of a vast maritime North Sea empire that encompassed not only England, but also Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden. Its strategic position on the Thames, providing swift access to the North Sea and continental Europe, made it the ideal administrative and commercial nexus for a Scandinavian king ruling a cross-channel empire. Knut recognized the city's importance, making it a primary royal residence and a key center for his imperial administration. He established a permanent elite bodyguard of professional warriors, the housecarls, stationing a significant contingent in the city and levying taxes on its citizens for their maintenance. The city's economy thrived under the new regime. The Pax Danica, or Danish peace, that Knut imposed across his territories created secure sea lanes, allowing London's merchants to dominate trade routes connecting England with Scandinavia, the Baltic, and the Rhineland. Archaeological finds from this period include an influx of Scandinavian-style metalwork and artifacts, testifying to the strong commercial and cultural links. Knut respected the city's existing governance and charters, ensuring the loyalty of its powerful merchant class. He also cultivated the English church, making generous grants to St. Paul's Cathedral and positioning himself as a legitimate Christian ruler. The presence of a significant Danish population is still marked by the Church of St. Clement Danes, originally a community established for the city's new Scandinavian inhabitants. During Knut's reign, London was no longer merely the foremost city of England. It was the powerful, wealthy, and strategic heart of a great northern empire. The collapse of Knut's North Sea Empire after his death paved the way for the restoration of the old Wessex dynasty in 1042 with the accession of Edward, son of Athelred the Unready. Known as Edward the Confessor for his piety, his long exile in Normandy had profoundly shaped his political and cultural outlook, leading him to favour Norman advisors at his court. This preference created significant tension with the established Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, most notably the powerful Godwin family, Earls of Wessex. Edward's reign would be defined by this internal political struggle and by a monumental act of patronage that would permanently alter London's political geography. Instead of centering his power within the commercially potent and fiercely independent walls of Londonderry, Edward deliberately established a new royal focus a few miles upriver. He chose a marshy site known as Thorney Island, the location of a modest Benedictine monastery. Here he commissioned the construction of the Palace of Westminster, a grand new royal residence that became the principal administrative centre of the kingdom. This strategic move physically and politically separated the royal court from the merchant-dominated city of London, initiating the capital's dual-poled identity that persists to this day. Alongside the palace, Edward began his great work, the complete refounding and rebuilding of the adjacent monastery. He envisioned a magnificent new church dedicated to St. Peter, which would serve as his own personal mausoleum and a statement of royal piety and power. The new abbey church was a radical architectural statement, constructed not in the Anglo-Saxon style, but in the new grand Romanesque form then flourishing in Normandy. It was the first church of its kind in England. The structure was enormous, featuring a cruciform plan with a central tower and soaring rounded arches, heavily influenced by continental designs like the Abbey of Jumièges. The project consumed vast resources and much of Edward's attention for 2 decades, intended as the spiritual heart of his kingdom. The great church was finally consecrated on December 28, 1065. Edward, however, was too gravely ill to attend the ceremony. He died just days later, in the first week of 1066, and was buried before the high altar of his newly completed masterpiece. In creating this royal and ecclesiastical complex at Westminster, Edward had established the enduring seat of English government and monarchy, a centre of power distinct from the economic might of the city. Edward the Confessor's death in January 1066 triggered a succession crisis that culminated in the Norman conquest. After his decisive victory at the Battle of Hastings, William of Normandy marched towards London, the kingdom's wealthiest and most fortified city. The London citizens initially supported the claim of the Saxon heir, Edgar the Atheling, and barred their gates against the conqueror. In response, William initiated a campaign of strategic encirclement, systematically devastating the surrounding counties of Surrey, Sussex, and Hertfordshire to sever the city's supply lines and demonstrate the futility of resistance. Faced with starvation and isolation, the leading magnates of London, including Edgar himself, finally submitted to William at Berkhamsted. On Christmas Day of 1066, William was crowned King of England in Edward's newly consecrated Westminster Abbey, the ceremony itself marred by the panicked reaction of his Norman guards who, mistaking the Saxon acclamation for a riot, set fire to nearby buildings. William understood that controlling England required absolute control over London, a city with a long history of fierce independence. Immediately following his coronation, he granted the city a charter confirming its traditional rights and privileges, a pragmatic gesture to secure the merchants' loyalty. Simultaneously, he began a program of military consolidation. His forces hastily erected 2 motte and bailey castles, temporary fortifications of earth and timber within the city walls to the west, Baynard's Castle and Montfichet's Tower. These served as immediate garrisons to police the population. However, for permanent domination, a more formidable statement was required. Around 1078, William commissioned a new kind of fortress, a great stone keep, to be built in the southeastern corner of the Roman walls, a strategic position that commanded the River Thames and the city's eastern approach. The construction, overseen by Gundulf, Bishop of Rochester, was an unprecedented military engineering project for England. The central keep, known as the White Tower, was a massive 4-turreted structure built in the austere and imposing Norman Romanesque style. Its walls, up to 15 feet thick at the base, were constructed primarily from Kentish ragstone, but were faced with brilliant white cane limestone, imported from Normandy, a foreign stone that made the fortress a stark and alien symbol of the new ruling power. The tower was designed not just for defense, but to overawe the Saxon populace. It functioned as a secure royal residence, a formidable garrison, a state prison, and an unassailable stronghold. The White Tower was the physical embodiment of the conquest, a permanent, unyielding stone fortress built to ensure London, and by extension England, would never again successfully defy its Norman masters. The Norman conquest did not unify London's centres of power, but instead institutionalised their separation, creating two distinct entities that would define the capital's development. While the Tower of London secured military control over the eastern flank, the royal court and nascent government bureaucracy became permanently fixed at Westminster. William the Conqueror's successors continued to expand upon Edward the Confessor's foundation. His son, William Rufus, commissioned the construction of Westminster Hall in 1097, a structure of vast scale intended for royal feasts and ceremonies, which soon became the physical home for the kingdom's highest legal bodies. Throughout the 12th century, key departments of state crystallized around the palace: the Exchequer, responsible for managing royal finances, and the Court of Common Pleas, which adjudicated legal disputes. This concentration of royal, judicial, and administrative functions made Westminster the undisputed political heart of England. Simultaneously, the walled city of London, just a few miles down the road, cultivated a fiercely independent identity rooted in commerce and civic governance. The Norman kings, reliant on the city's vast wealth to fund their statecraft and wars, continued to grant charters that affirmed its autonomy in exchange for financial support and political loyalty. A charter from Henry I in 1132 granted the citizens the right to appoint their own sheriff and collect their own taxes. This process of self-governance culminated in 1189, when the city's leading citizens secured the right to have a mayor, a communal form of government that placed London on par with the great independent cities of continental Europe. The first mayor, Henry Fitz-Aylwin, presided over a sophisticated administration managed by aldermen and a powerful council. The city's power was built on its burgeoning port and international trade. Foreign merchant communities established permanent bases, or compters, within its wards. German merchants of the Hanseatic League operated from the Steelyard, a walled compound with its own warehouses and residences, while Jewish financiers, protected by the king for their vital role in providing credit, settled in a district near the modern Guildhall. The great merchant guilds, the mercers, grocers, drapers, began to form, regulating trade and accumulating immense political influence. This divergence was now complete. Westminster was the seat of the Crown and Parliament, a centre of national politics and law. The City of London was a self-governing commercial republic, a powerhouse of finance and trade whose relationship with the Crown was one of mutual and often wary dependence. The civic independence secured by London's charters provided the fertile ground for a new form of internal power structure: the guilds. Originating as religious fraternities or local associations for mutual protection, these organizations evolved throughout the 12th and 13th centuries into sophisticated and powerful bodies that regulated nearly every aspect of the city's economic life. Each craft and trade formed its own guild, from the weavers and goldsmiths to the fishmongers and skinners. These institutions were not merely commercial, they were comprehensive social and political entities. They enforced strict quality standards on goods, set fair prices, and standardized weights and measures, creating a regulated market that built London's reputation for reliable commerce. Crucially, they controlled the system of apprenticeship, a 7-year period of training that was the sole path to becoming a master craftsman and a recognized citizen. This allowed the guilds to manage the labor supply, limit competition, and maintain the value of their skills. By the 14th century, the most prosperous of these guilds had transformed into the great livery companies, so named for the distinctive ceremonial robes, or livery, that their senior members wore. A rigid hierarchy emerged, dominated by the Great 12 companies, including the mercers, grocers, drapers, and goldsmiths, whose wealth, derived from international trade and finance, dwarfed that of the smaller craft guilds. This economic dominance translated directly into political power. To conduct business or hold any civic office, one first had to be a freeman of the city, and admission to this status became almost exclusively controlled by the livery companies. The city's government, through the Court of Aldermen and the Court of Common Council, became the exclusive domain of the masters and wardens of these companies. The office of the Lord Mayor of London, the city's highest authority, was invariably filled by a senior member of one of the Great 12. This system created a deeply entrenched merchant oligarchy. A small, interconnected elite of the city's wealthiest men now governed London as a de facto city-state. Their power manifested in the construction of magnificent livery halls that served as their corporate headquarters. This powerful oligarchy managed the city's finances, its infrastructure, and its complex relationship with the crown, ensuring that the interests of commerce remained paramount in the governance of England's greatest city. The uneasy balance between the crown and the City of London reached a critical juncture during the reign of King John. His ruinous foreign wars and arbitrary financial demands placed immense strain on the kingdom's barons, and crucially, on London's merchants. As baronial opposition to the king coalesced, London's oligarchy made a decisive strategic choice. In May 1215, the citizens opened their gates to the rebel army, providing the baronial cause with an impregnable fortress, a capital city, and access to the financial resources necessary to challenge the monarch. This act of strategic allegiance was not merely symbolic, it was the tipping point that forced King John to negotiate, leading directly to the momentous confrontation at Runnymede. The resulting document, the Magna Carta of 1215, was primarily a settlement between the king and his feudal barons, but London's contribution was explicitly rewarded. Clause 13 of the Great Charter was of monumental importance, stating that the City of London shall have all its ancient liberties and free customs, both by land and by water. This was not the creation of new rights, but the powerful confirmation of the city's existing autonomy, now enshrined within a document that purported to bind the king himself under the rule of law. Furthermore, clauses that standardized weights and measures, such as the London Quarter for corn, directly benefited the city's commercial interests by creating a more predictable national market. Even more significant was a separate, contemporary charter that John was compelled to issue in the same year. While the city had asserted its right to a mayor since 1189, the Crown had never formally and permanently conceded this right. The Charter of 1215 changed that, explicitly granting the citizens of London the right to freely elect their mayor every year, subject only to the formality of presenting the chosen candidate to the king or his justices for approval. This transformed the mayoralty from a contested privilege into a legally guaranteed institution. The events of 1215 provided the unassailable legal foundation for London's unique status. The Magna Carta and its associated charters codified the city's freedoms, protecting its commercial oligarchy from the arbitrary whims of the Crown and cementing the Lord Mayoralty as one of the most powerful and independent civic offices in Europe. Amidst the City of London's rising commercial power, one of its own sons became the central figure in a dramatic conflict that pitted the authority of the Church against the English crown. Thomas Becket was born around 1120 on Cheapside, the son of a prosperous Norman merchant, embodying the city's ambitious new class. His sharp intellect earned him an excellent education, leading to a position in the household of Theobald of Bec, the Archbishop of Canterbury. His administrative talents were so profound that he quickly came to the attention of the new king Henry II, who in 1155 appointed the Londoner as his chancellor. For 7 years, Becket was the king's closest friend and most effective servant, ruthlessly enforcing royal authority and living a lavish secular lifestyle. The relationship fractured irrevocably in 1162 when Henry engineered Becket's election as the new Archbishop of Canterbury, expecting his loyal chancellor to subordinate the church to royal interests. Instead, Becket underwent a profound transformation, resigning the chancellorship and embracing a life of asceticism, now fiercely defending ecclesiastical privileges with the same energy he had once used to defend the king's. The conflict came to a head in 1164 with the Constitutions of Clarendon, a series of 16 articles designed to restrict papal authority in England and subject clergy to trial in secular courts. Becket's resolute refusal to assent to these articles led to his flight and a 6-year exile in France. He returned to England in late 1170, his position seemingly irreconcilable with the king's. The final crisis was precipitated by Henry's famous, frustrated outburst, often rendered as, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" Taking this as a royal command, 4 knights Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard le Breton travelled to Canterbury. On December 29, 1170, they confronted Becket in his own cathedral. When he refused to submit, they cut him down with their swords near the altar. The brutal murder of an archbishop in a sacred space sent shockwaves of horror across Christendom. The act backfired catastrophically on the king, who was forced into a humiliating public penance. Becket was swiftly canonized as a martyr by Pope Alexander III in 1173, and his tomb at Canterbury became the premier pilgrimage site in England, a potent symbol of spiritual authority over temporal power, championed by the city that had given him birth. In the autumn of 1348, a calamity of unprecedented scale reached London. The Great Pestilence, known to history as the Black Death, arrived not as an army but as an invisible contagion, carried along trade routes into a city utterly unprepared for its biological onslaught. London's population, densely packed within its ancient walls, lived in conditions ripe for epidemic. With limited sanitation and a reliance on a contaminated Thames, the bacterium Yersinia pestis spread with terrifying speed. The city's existing social and religious structures collapsed under the strain of the mortality. Contemporary chroniclers record a death toll that is difficult to comprehend, with modern estimates suggesting that between 40 and 50% of London's inhabitants perished in little more than a year. The most immediate crisis was logistical: the disposal of the dead. The small churchyards of the city's 100 parishes were overwhelmed within weeks. Normal burial rites were abandoned as the sheer volume of corpses made them impossible. To solve this, new emergency cemeteries were hastily consecrated outside the city walls. 2 major sites were established, one at East Smithfield and another in a plot of land near West Smithfield, purchased by the courtier Sir Walter Manny. Archaeological excavations at these locations, such as those at Charterhouse Square, have since uncovered the stark reality of the plague pit's mass graves, with skeletons layered 5 deep, buried without coffins or ceremony. The aftermath of the plague was not a return to normality, but a profound and permanent restructuring of society. The catastrophic loss of life created an acute labour shortage. For the first time, surviving peasants and artisans found themselves in a position of power. They could demand significantly higher wages and were no longer tied to their manorial lords by feudal obligation. The landed and merchant elites, including the powerful livery companies, saw their control over the workforce evaporate. In response, the Crown enacted the Statute of Labourers in 1351, a draconian attempt to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and restrict the movement of workers. The legislation was almost entirely unenforceable and bred deep resentment among the lower classes. The Great Pestilence had not just killed half of London, it had fatally wounded the feudal economic system, empowering a new, mobile labouring class and sowing the seeds of social conflict that would erupt in the coming decades. The deep social resentment sown by the post-plague labour statutes festered for 3 decades before a new fiscal policy provided the final catalyst for open rebellion. To fund the costly and unsuccessful 100 Years' War with France, the government of the young King Richard II imposed a series of deeply unpopular poll taxes. The third such tax, levied in 1380, was particularly inflammatory as it was set at a flat rate, demanding a shilling from every adult, a crushing burden on the labouring poor. When royal commissioners were dispatched in 1381 to investigate widespread evasion, their aggressive methods triggered violent resistance. First, in the Essex villages of Fobbing and Brentwood, the insurrection spread with remarkable speed, coalescing into two main rebel armies from Kent and Essex. The Kentishmen found a charismatic and militarily competent leader in Wat Tyler, while the rebels' ideological fervour was stoked by the radical preacher John Ball, recently freed from prison, who famously questioned the basis of the class system. In early June 1381, these converging forces marched on London. Crucially, the city's gates were opened to them, likely at Aldgate, by sympathetic citizens and aldermen who shared their animosity towards the King's Council. Once inside, the rebels' actions were not random but highly targeted. They systematically destroyed the Savoy Palace, the magnificent London residence of the deeply unpopular John of Gaunt, making a point to burn it rather than loot it to demonstrate political purpose. Their primary targets were the architects of the poll tax. On June 14th, the rebels stormed the Tower of London, a supposedly impregnable fortress, and dragged out Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Chancellor, and Sir Robert Hales, the Lord High Treasurer. Both men were summarily beheaded on Tower Hill in front of a cheering crowd. The following day, the young king agreed to meet the rebels at Smithfield. There, Wat Tyler presented a revolutionary set of demands: the abolition of serfdom, an end to all lordship except the king's direct authority, and the seizure of church lands. During the tense negotiations, an altercation erupted. William Walworth, the Mayor of London, struck Tyler with a dagger, and one of the king's squires delivered the fatal blow. As the rebel army surged forward, the 14-year-old Richard rode directly towards them, declaring himself their true leader and promising to grant their charters. This act of immense bravery diffused the immediate crisis, luring the rebels out of the city. Once the host dispersed, the king's promises were swiftly revoked, and the revolt was brutally suppressed. Yet the poll tax was never again attempted, and the uprising had irrevocably demonstrated the new collective power of the English Commons. The figure who best personifies the vast wealth and civic power of late medieval London is obscured by folklore, yet the historical reality is more significant than the pantomime myth. Richard Whittington was not a destitute orphan who found his fortune through a cat, but the younger son of a Gloucestershire knight who arrived in the city to become an apprentice. His chosen trade was that of a mercer, placing him at the pinnacle of the city's commercial hierarchy. The mercer's company dealt not in common goods but in luxury textiles, velvet, damask, and cloth of gold, an international trade that generated immense profits and required substantial capital. Whittington excelled in this high-stakes environment, becoming one of the wealthiest individuals in England. His true fortune, however, was built upon a second career as a financier. Whittington became the primary banker to the English crown, providing enormous loans to three successive kings: Richard II, Henry IV, and Henry V. These were not minor sums. They were vast infusions of capital that funded royal households, military campaigns, and state administration. This financial leverage gave him unparalleled political influence. His economic power translated directly into civic authority. He was appointed to complete the term of a deceased Lord Mayor in 1397, and was subsequently elected to the position on 3 more occasions, serving a total of 4 terms. This repeated elevation to the city's highest office demonstrates the trust placed in him by the merchant oligarchy and the respect he commanded from the crown. Whittington's most enduring legacy was his philanthropy, detailed in the will he executed before his death in 1423. Having no children, he bequeathed his entire fortune to the city for a series of transformative public works. His executors funded the rebuilding of his parish church, St. Michael Paternoster Royal, and the foundation of the Whittington Almshouse for the poor. He financed a new library for the Guildhall, and paid for significant repairs to the building itself. His benefactions had a practical, civic-minded focus. He endowed a ward for unmarried mothers at St. Thomas's Hospital, and funded the construction of London's first major public latrine, a 128-seat facility called Whittington's Longhouse that emptied directly into the Thames. The reality of Dick Whittington reveals more about London than any folktale. It shows a city where immense commercial wealth could be converted into royal influence, civic leadership, and a permanent architectural and social legacy, defining the power of its merchant class. Throughout the dynastic convulsions of the mid-15th century, London was not merely a backdrop for the Wars of the Roses, but the ultimate prize, whose allegiance could make or break a king. The city's immense financial resources and strategic importance transformed it into the decisive arbiter between the rival houses of Lancaster and York. The loyalty of its powerful merchant oligarchy was never ideological. It was a pragmatic calculation based on which faction could best guarantee the stability essential for commerce. The weak and intermittent rule of the Lancastrian Henry VI, marked by military failures in France and civil disorder at home, had severely disrupted trade, leaving the city's leadership deeply receptive to the Yorkist promise of competent governance. This pragmatism dictated the city's actions at every crucial juncture. After the Yorkist victory at the First Battle of St. Albans in 1455, London remained cautiously neutral, hosting the hollow reconciliation ceremony known as the Love Day in 1458, which only highlighted the city's role as the central stage for national politics. The pivotal moment came in 1461. After the Lancastrian victory at the Second Battle of St. Albans, Queen Margaret of Anjou's northern army was poised to take the capital. However, reports of her army's pillaging as it moved south terrified the London establishment. Fearing looting and the breakdown of order, the city's governors refused entry to the Lancastrians and instead threw open their gates to the young Edward, Earl of March. This welcome was the single most important factor in his ascension. It provided him with the legitimacy, the financial backing, and the public acclamation he needed to be crowned King Edward IV. A decade later, London's allegiance was tested again. In 1470, during the brief redemption of Henry VI engineered by Warwick the Kingmaker, the city once more pragmatically accepted the prevailing power. Yet, when Edward IV returned from exile in 1471, the civic leaders again made a decisive choice. They admitted him back into the city, providing the crucial funds and a secure base from which he could launch his final campaign. This support directly enabled his victories at the battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury, which annihilated the Lancastrian cause. The Wars of the Roses were won and lost, not just on the battlefield, but at the gates of London. The city's consistent policy of backing the claimant who could best secure commerce and property made its merchant class the true kingmakers of the age. The accession of Henry VIII in 1509 inaugurated an era of royal magnificence that shifted London's centre of gravity decisively towards the court. While the City of London retained its commercial autonomy, national power now emanated from the King's opulent palaces at Whitehall and Greenwich. This Renaissance court, a hub of humanist scholarship, artistic patronage, and lavish display, soon became the engine for the most radical transformation of London's landscape in a millennium. The catalyst was the king's determination to secure a male heir, leading to his break with the papacy and the Act of Supremacy of 1534, which declared him the supreme head of the Church of England. This assertion of royal authority over spiritual matters had immediate and profound consequences for the city's physical and social fabric. The primary targets of this new power were the monastic houses, which for centuries had been major landowners, employers, and centres of charity and learning. In 1535, a comprehensive survey of all ecclesiastical property, the Valor Ecclesiasticus, provided the Crown with a detailed inventory of this immense wealth. The process of suppression began methodically in 1536 with the closure of the smaller monasteries. By 1540, all of London's great religious houses had been extinguished. The Priory of Holy Trinity at Aldgate, the Augustinian Priory Hospital of St. Bartholomew the Great, and the great friaries of the Dominicans, Black Friars, Carmelites, White Friars, and Franciscans, Grey Friars, were all seized. These institutions were not just buildings, they were vast complexes of churches, cloisters, gardens, and tenements that occupied a substantial portion of the city's area. This act constituted the largest single transfer of land in English history since the Norman conquest. The Crown took possession of these sprawling properties, and Henry, always in need of funds for his continental wars and extravagant court, began to sell or grant them to loyal courtiers, nobles, and wealthy merchants. This created a new Tudor aristocracy, whose fortunes were inextricably linked to the religious Reformation. The monastic buildings themselves were repurposed or demolished. The Blackfriars precinct became a fashionable residential area and was later home to one of London's first theatres. The grounds of the Charterhouse were transformed into a mansion for Sir Edward North. This systematic dismantling of the medieval religious infrastructure irrevocably altered the map of London, sweeping away centuries of monastic life and creating a new secular landscape dominated by the palaces and townhouses of a new royalist elite. The explosion of dramatic art in the late Tudor period was a phenomenon that occurred not within the City of London, but defiantly outside its jurisdiction. The Puritangent-influenced city corporation viewed public playhouses as dens of idleness, vice, and potential plague transmission, and therefore banned their construction within the city walls. This prohibition forced the burgeoning entertainment industry into the Liberties, areas of autonomous governance located just beyond the city's control. The most notorious of these was Bankside in Southwark, a district across the Thames already infamous for its bear-baiting arenas, brothels, and taverns. It was here, amidst the disreputable and the unregulated, that the purpose-built public theatre found its home and genius its stage. The most famous of these playhouses, the Globe, was born from a property dispute. The first major theatre, simply called the Theatre, had been erected in the northern liberty of Shoreditch in 1576 by the actor-manager James Burbage. When the lease on the land expired in 1597, the landlord refused to renew it. In a remarkable act of theatrical enterprise, Burbage's sons, Cuthbert and Richard, along with their acting company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, dismantled the entire timber structure over the Christmas of 1598. They transported the massive beams across the frozen Thames and reassembled them on a new plot of land on Bankside, creating the Globe Theatre in 1599. It was a shareholder venture, with the Burbage brothers holding a 50% stake, and the other half divided among senior members of the company, including their principal playwright, William Shakespeare. This polygonal open-air amphitheatre became the premier venue for the Lord Chamberlain's Men, showcasing the mature works of Shakespeare, from the Roman tragedies to the great Jacobean dramas. It operated in direct competition with the nearby Rose Theatre, managed by Philip Henslowe and home to the plays of the brilliant Christopher Marlowe until his untimely death. The Globe's commercial success was predicated on a constant demand for new material and its appeal to a socially diverse audience. For a single penny, a groundling could stand in the open yard before the thrust stage, while wealthier patrons paid more for seats in the tiered covered galleries. This business model, driven by popular taste and prolific genius, cemented Southwark's status as the heart of an Elizabethan cultural revolution that the city authorities could neither suppress nor control. Under Elizabeth I, London transformed into the dynamic heart of a Protestant nation, asserting itself on a global stage, a city of unprecedented commercial grandeur, shadowed by constant intrigue. The Queen's long reign fostered a new level of national confidence, which was physically manifested in the city's architecture and economic institutions. The most potent symbol of this was the Royal Exchange, founded by the financier Sir Thomas Gresham in 1565, and opened by the Queen herself in 1571. This purpose-built bourse provided London's merchants with a dedicated centre for commerce, a direct rival to the great exchanges of Antwerp, and a clear statement of the city's ambition to become the financial hub of Northern Europe. The city's population swelled, attracting migrants from across the kingdom and the continent, pushing its boundaries and creating a sprawling, energetic, and often volatile metropolis. This commercial energy was inextricably linked to the age of exploration. London was the primary engine of England's maritime expansion, with its merchants and nobles forming joint stock companies to finance voyages that sought to break the Iberian monopoly on world trade. From the docks at Deptford and Blackwall, expeditions led by figures like Martin Frobisher set out in search of the Northwest Passage, while privateers such as Francis Drake were backed by city investors, including the Queen herself, to plunder Spanish shipping in the New World. The return of Drake's Golden Hind to the Thames in 1580, its hold laden with Spanish treasure, represented a massive return on investment for his London backers and injected a huge influx of bullion directly into the city's economy. London was no longer just a regional trading port. It was the command centre for a nascent global enterprise. This outward-looking ambition was mirrored by a pervasive sense of internal and external threat, turning the capital into a centre of state surveillance. The primary danger came from Catholic plots aimed at deposing Elizabeth and installing her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, on the throne, often with the support of Philip II of Spain. To counter this, Elizabeth's principal secretary, Sir Francis Walsingham, established and operated Europe's most sophisticated intelligence network from his London base. His agents, cryptographers, and informants infiltrated Catholic circles at home and abroad. The network's greatest triumph was the uncovering of the Babington Plot in 1586, when Walsingham's codebreakers intercepted and deciphered correspondence between Mary and the conspirators. This irrefutable evidence, gathered and analysed in London, led directly to Mary's trial and execution, securing the Protestant succession and demonstrating that the capital was not just a centre of wealth, but the nerve centre of the Elizabethan state's security apparatus. The accession of James I in 1603, uniting the crowns of Scotland and England, was met with a cautious optimism that masked deep-seated religious fissures within the capital. As the son of the Catholic martyr Mary, Queen of Scots, many of England's persecuted Catholics hoped the new Stuart king would usher in an era of greater religious tolerance. This hope was quickly extinguished. James, a staunch Protestant, not only maintained Elizabeth's anti-Catholic policies, but in 1604 publicly declared his utter detestation of popery and intensified the collection of recusancy fines for non-attendance at Anglican services. It was within this climate of renewed persecution and dashed hopes that a small group of provincial Catholic gentry, despairing of any political solution, conceived a plan of unprecedented audacity. The conspiracy was masterminded not in London, but in the Midlands by Robert Catesby, a charismatic gentleman with a history of recusant activism. The operational core of the plot, however, was focused on a specific target in the heart of Westminster, the House of Lords. The plan was to assassinate the king, his heir, and the entire Protestant political establishment in a single catastrophic explosion during the state opening of Parliament. To execute this, the plotters leased a cellar directly beneath the Lord's chamber. The man tasked with guarding the explosives and lighting the fuse was Guy Fawkes, a soldier whose experience with munitions gained fighting for Spain in the Low Countries made him the group's technical expert. By the autumn of 1605, 36 barrels of gunpowder were secretly transported by boat along the Thames and hidden under a pile of firewood in the rented space, awaiting the revised opening date of November 5th. The plot was ultimately undone by an act of conscience. On October 26th, an anonymous letter was delivered to the Catholic Lord Monteagle, warning him to avoid the opening of Parliament. Monteagle immediately passed the letter to Robert Cecil, the Earl of Salisbury and the King's chief minister, who initiated a search of the Palace of Westminster. In the early hours of November 5th, a search party led by Sir Thomas Knivet discovered Fawkes in the cellar. He was arrested, and the vast quantity of gunpowder was secured. Under torture in the Tower of London, Fawkes revealed the names of his co-conspirators. Catesby and several others were killed resisting capture at Holbeck House in Staffordshire, while the survivors were brought back to London, tried at Westminster Hall, and publicly hanged, drawn, and quartered. The immediate aftermath in London was a wave of anti-Catholic hysteria and the imposition of even harsher penal laws, while the state-mandated celebration of the plot's failure with bonfires ensured that the event would become permanently embedded in the city's and the nation's collective memory. The outbreak began subtly, following a harsh winter in 1664. The first officially recorded plague deaths occurred in the impoverished, overcrowded parish of St. Giles in the Fields, an area outside the city walls. For months, the weekly bills of mortality, the city's official death registers, recorded a small but persistent number of plague victims. But as the weather warmed into the spring and summer of 1665, the numbers began to rise exponentially. The infection, carried by fleas on black rats that thrived in the city's squalid conditions, spread relentlessly from the western suburbs eastward, breaching the ancient Roman walls and infiltrating the dense warren of the city itself. The response from the elite was swift and predictable. In July, King Charles II and his court abandoned London for the safety of Salisbury, and later Oxford. They were followed by a mass exodus of the wealthy, merchants, lawyers, and physicians who could afford to leave, effectively abandoning the capital to its fate. Authority fell to those who remained, most notably the Lord Mayor, Sir John Lawrence, and the city's aldermen. They enforced a set of plague orders based on Tudor-era precedents. The core of this strategy was household quarantine. Once a case of plague was identified in a house, the dwelling was sealed from the outside, with all inhabitants, sick and healthy alike, locked inside for a 40-day period. A red cross was painted on the door, accompanied by the words, "Lord have mercy upon us," to serve as a public warning. A watchman was posted outside to prevent anyone from entering or leaving. This policy, while intended to contain the spread, effectively turned homes into tombs for entire families. The task of identifying victims fell to searchers of the dead, typically poor, elderly women who were paid to inspect corpses and determine the cause of death. As the epidemic reached its horrifying peak in late August and September, the civic infrastructure collapsed under the strain. At its worst, over 7,000 deaths were officially recorded in a single week, though the true figure was certainly far higher, as clerks were overwhelmed, and deaths from other causes were often misattributed. The dead were collected at night by death carts, their drivers ringing a bell and crying, "Bring out your dead." Bodies were transported to vast, hastily dug plague pits, such as the one at Aldgate, and buried without ceremony in mass graves. Commerce ceased, the Thames fell silent, and grass grew in the streets of Whitehall. By the time the plague's fury abated with the onset of cold weather, it had claimed an estimated 100,000 lives, roughly a quarter of London's population, leaving behind a city traumatized and profoundly altered by the scale of its loss. Just over a year after the plague had subsided, the city's second great calamity of the decade began in the early morning hours of Sunday, September 2nd, 1666. The fire originated in a bakehouse on Pudding Lane belonging to Thomas Fariner, baker to King Charles II. An ember, likely from an oven that had not been properly extinguished, ignited a pile of firewood. The building, like the vast majority of London's structures, was a timber-framed house with jettied upper floors that nearly touched those across the narrow lane, creating a tunnel for drafts. A strong easterly wind, combined with a preceding long, dry summer, provided the perfect conditions for the initial spark to grow into an inferno. The fire quickly consumed the bakery and spread to adjacent buildings, its progress accelerated by the contents of nearby warehouses along the Thames, which were filled with combustible materials such as oil, tallow, pitch, and spirits. The initial civic response was catastrophically inadequate. The Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was roused from his sleep but dismissed the incident, famously remarking that a woman might urinate it out. This indecision proved fatal. The standard firefighting practice of the era was the creation of firebreaks by demolishing houses in the fire's path, using long firehooks and explosives. Bloodworth hesitated to authorize such destructive measures, fearing the cost and the need to compensate property owners. By the time the scale of the disaster became undeniable, the fire had grown too large and fierce for the primitive parish fire engines and bucket brigades to have any effect. The wind fanned the flames westward, turning the dense collection of wooden buildings into a self-sustaining firestorm that generated its own weather system, with superheated air drawing in oxygen and propelling the blaze forward. Over the next 3 days, the fire advanced relentlessly through the heart of the medieval city. It consumed the commercial centre, destroying the Royal Exchange, the financial hub established under Elizabeth I. The Guildhall, the seat of civic government, was left a gutted shell. On Tuesday, the fire reached St. Paul's Cathedral. The immense structure, which was undergoing repairs and surrounded by wooden scaffolding, was quickly engulfed. Its massive lead roof melted, with molten metal reportedly flowing down Ludgate Hill like a river. The crypt, filled with books and papers stored by the stationers of Paternoster Row, acted as an oven, ensuring the cathedral's complete destruction. The blaze was only halted on Wednesday, September 5th, when the easterly wind finally died down and coordinated efforts, led by the King's brother, the Duke of York, began using gunpowder from the Tower of London to create effective fire breaks, a measure the Lord Mayor had delayed for too long. The fire had burned for 4 days, annihilating 80% of the walled city. The final toll was 13,200 houses, 87 parish churches, and 44 livery company halls destroyed, leaving over 100,000 people homeless, but, remarkably, with an official death toll of less than 10. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, the city faced a reconstruction challenge of unprecedented scale. Before the embers had fully cooled, several plans for a redesigned London were submitted to King Charles II, the most ambitious of which came from Dr. Christopher Wren, then Savilian Professor of Astronomy at Oxford. Wren's radical proposal envisioned a continental-style city of wide, straight boulevards and grand piazzas, completely ignoring the medieval street plan. While admired for its logic and grandeur, this vision was swiftly rejected. Due to the immense practical difficulty of re-establishing thousands of individual property deeds, and the overwhelming desire of merchants to rebuild and resume commerce as quickly as possible. Instead, the reconstruction was governed by a series of rebuilding acts, beginning in 1667. These new regulations fundamentally altered the city's fabric, mandating the use of brick and stone for all new construction and prohibiting timber framing and jettied overhangs. The legislation also standardized house designs into 4 classes based on the width of the street they faced, creating a more uniform and fire-resistant urban environment. Wren, appointed as one of the 6 commissioners for rebuilding and later as Surveyor General of the King's Works, was given direct oversight of the monumental task of reconstructing the city's ecclesiastical heart. Of the 87 parish churches destroyed, he was personally responsible for the redesign and construction of 51. Working with a team that included the brilliant Nicholas Hawksmoor, Wren displayed remarkable ingenuity, fitting classically inspired Baroque designs into the irregular medieval plots. He created a new skyline for London, defined by a forest of varied and elegant steeples, each unique in its design, from the layered spire of St. Bride's, Fleet Street, to the intricate lantern of St. Stephen Walbrook. His magnum opus, however, was the new St. Paul's Cathedral. After initial surveys proved that the ruined shell of the old Norman and Gothic structure was unsalvageable, Wren developed several proposals. His personal favourite, the Great Model Design, based on a Greek cross plan, was deemed too radical by the cathedral chapter. The final approved warrant design of 1,675 was a compromise, but Wren retained the authority to make ornamental changes during construction. He used this authority to create his masterpiece. Built from Portland stone, the new cathedral's most defining feature was its revolutionary dome, a complex 3-part structure consisting of a shallow inner dome for internal aesthetics, a central brick cone for structural support, and a timber-framed outer dome covered in lead to dominate the skyline. The foundation stone was laid in 1675, and the final stone of the lantern was placed by Wren's son in 1708, 33 years later, completing an architectural project that redefined the city's identity and stood as a testament to its resilience. The reign of James II, beginning in 1685, steadily cultivated an atmosphere of deep political and religious anxiety within London. The new king, an avowed Catholic, moved systematically to dismantle the legal framework that excluded his co-religionists from public life. His use of the royal dispensing power to appoint Catholics to high office in the army, the Privy Council, and the universities was viewed by the city's Protestant establishment not as an act of toleration, but as a direct assault on parliamentary authority and the rule of law. The tension escalated dramatically with his declarations of indulgence, which suspended the penal laws against both Catholics and Protestant dissenters. In 1688, James ordered the clergy to read the second declaration from their pulpits, a command that the Archbishop of Canterbury and 6 other bishops refused. Their subsequent arrest and imprisonment in the Tower of London turned them into national heroes. When the 7 bishops were tried for seditious libel at Westminster Hall, their acquittal was met with public jubilation across the capital, a clear sign of the monarch's collapsing authority. The final catalyst for revolution was a dynastic event, the birth of a son, James Francis Edward Stuart, to James and his Catholic wife, Mary of Modena, in June 1688. This unforeseen development created the immediate prospect of a permanent Catholic succession, an outcome the nation's political and religious elite deemed intolerable. Within weeks, a clandestine group of 7 prominent nobles and churchmen, the Immortal Seven, dispatched a formal invitation from London to the Dutch stadtholder, William of Orange, who was married to James's Protestant daughter, Mary. They invited him to invade England with an army to secure the Protestant religion and the liberties of the kingdom. William landed at Torbay in November 1688 and began a slow advance toward the capital. As he progressed, James II's support evaporated. Key military commanders, including John Churchill, deserted to William's side. In London, the news prompted widespread anti-Catholic rioting. Mobs, often encouraged by Whig agents, attacked and burned newly established Catholic chapels, schools, and the residences of prominent Catholics. The hated Lord Chancellor, Judge Jeffreys, was discovered in a Wapping tavern disguised as a sailor and was only saved from being torn apart by the crowd by the intervention of the militia. Faced with total political collapse, James attempted to flee to France but was captured in Kent. In a calculated move, William allowed him to escape a second time, successfully avoiding the creation of a royal martyr. William entered London in December to a carefully orchestrated welcome, securing the Tower and taking up residence at St James's Palace. The following month, the Convention Parliament met at Westminster and, after intense debate, declared that James II had, by his flight, abdicated the throne. It offered the crown jointly to William and Mary, a transfer of power conditional upon their acceptance of the Declaration of Right, which was formally read to them in the banqueting house at Whitehall and later enacted as the Bill of Rights, establishing a new constitutional monarchy. The political settlement of the Glorious Revolution coincided with a social and economic transformation driven not from the palace or parliament, but from a new type of public establishment, the coffee house. Introduced to London in 1652 by Pasquale Rosé in St Michael's Alley, these institutions proliferated with astonishing speed, numbering over 500 by the reign of Queen Anne. For the price of a penny, any man could purchase a dish of coffee and gain entry into a space dedicated to conversation, commerce, and the consumption of information. Termed penny universities, they fostered a unique environment of social mixing, where men from different classes could engage in sober debate, a stark contrast to the alcohol-fueled environment of the tavern. Each coffee house developed a distinct clientele, creating a network of specialized hubs across the city. Will's Coffee House in Covent Garden became the epicenter of literary life, dominated by figures like John Dryden, while scientists from the Royal Society gathered at the Grecian on the Strand to discuss experiments and theories. This specialization was most consequential in the City of London, where coffee houses became the crucibles for modern financial institutions. In a house on Tower Street, opened by Edward Lloyd in the 1680s, merchants, ship owners, and underwriters gathered to share the latest maritime intelligence. Lloyd facilitated this by providing reliable shipping news, creating a centralized marketplace for marine insurance that would evolve directly into the globally significant institution of Lloyd's of London. A few streets away, in Change Alley, establishments like Jonathan's and Garraway's became the primary venues for the buying and selling of company stocks and government securities. The frantic activity of brokers and stock jobbers in these houses was the direct precursor to the London Stock Exchange, which was formally established by a group of brokers who had been expelled from the Royal Exchange for their rowdiness. The coffee houses were also the nerve centres of a nascent news industry. Proprietors subscribed to a wide array of domestic and foreign newspapers, newsletters, and gazettes, making them available to all patrons. Runners moved between houses, sharing the latest political gossip from Westminster or commercial data from the docks. Tallow candles illuminated handwritten notices of auctions and sales pinned to the walls. The free exchange of information and the vigorous political debate they encouraged, particularly after the lapse of the Licensing of the Press Act in 1695 led to an explosion in print, were instrumental in creating an informed public sphere. These houses were the city's forums, its marketplaces, and its newsrooms, laying the institutional groundwork for the financial and media structures of the modern world. By the late 18th century, the commercial success born in London's coffee houses and exchanges was physically strangling the city's ancient riverine heart. The Port of London, legally confined to a series of legal quays between London Bridge and the Tower, was catastrophically congested. A forest of masts clogged the Pool of London, with ships waiting weeks or even months to unload their cargo onto smaller lighters, which then ferried goods to the overcrowded wharves. This chaotic system was notoriously inefficient and rife with corruption and theft. Organized gangs of river pirates, night plunderers, and light horsemen systematically looted cargoes, while an army of opportunistic mudlarks scavenged for anything dropped or discarded. The annual losses from pilferage were estimated to be in the hundreds of thousands of pounds, a crippling tax on the burgeoning trade of an expanding empire. The existing infrastructure, designed for a medieval scale of commerce, was simply incapable of handling the sheer volume of sugar, rum, and coffee from the West Indies, tea and spices from the East, and timber from the Baltic. The response to this crisis was one of the greatest civil engineering projects of the age: the construction of vast, enclosed, wet docks. This revolutionary concept involved digging huge, secure basins off the main channel of the Thames, where ships could moor in calm water, protected from the river's tides and thieves by high walls and a dedicated police force. The first and most ambitious of these projects was the West India Docks, authorised by an Act of Parliament in 1799. Built across the Isle of Dogs, it comprised two massive basins, one for import, one for export, and opened in 1802. Surrounded by a 20-foot-high brick wall, this secure zone was a self-contained world of commerce, its warehouses capable of storing immense quantities of colonial produce. The success of this venture triggered a dock-building boom. The London docks at Wapping, opened in 1805, were constructed specifically for high-value goods, featuring vast, climate-controlled vaults for wine, brandy, and tobacco. A year later, the East India Company, which had previously used its own mooring at Blackwall, opened the East India Docks. This was followed by the St. Catherine Docks in 1828. Built right next to the Tower of London, after the controversial demolition of an entire parish. These new complexes were more than just infrastructure. They were the engine rooms of empire. They professionalized cargo handling, dramatically reduced transit times, and allowed for the use of much larger ocean-going vessels. The construction of these docks transformed the landscape east of the city, creating a new London defined not by spires, but by the stark functional geometry of brick warehouses, granite quaysides, and the controlled waters that connected the capital to every corner of its global empire. While London's docks engineered an empire of goods, the city's poorest districts were being consumed by an epidemic of cheap spirits. The gin craze, a period of unprecedented public intoxication, began in the early 18th century, fueled by a combination of government policy and economic circumstance. A series of acts designed to encourage English distilling to use surplus grain, coupled with a ban on French brandy imports, had effectively deregulated the market. The result was a deluge of raw, potent, and incredibly cheap gin. By the 1730s, London was saturated with it. In parishes like St Giles, it was estimated that 1 in every 4 houses was a gin shop, with thousands more selling the spirit from cellars, back rooms, and street barrows. For a penny, a person could get drunk, and for 2 pennies, they could be dead drunk, with straw provided in the back for them to pass out on. The social consequences were catastrophic. Mortality rates in the capital, which had been declining, began to soar, driven by alcohol-related deaths, destitution, and child neglect. The crisis was most vividly captured by the artist William Hogarth in his 1751 engravings, Beer Street and Gin Lane. While Beer Street depicted a scene of healthy, prosperous Londoners enjoying a nourishing native beverage, Gin Lane presented a terrifying vision of the alternative. It is a catalogue of social collapse, a skeletal ballad. Seller starves to death, a builder falls from a roof in a drunken stupor, and most notoriously, a syphilitic mother, oblivious with intoxication, lets her infant fall to its death over a railing. The only thriving businesses are the pawnbroker, the undertaker, and the distiller. Hogarth's work was not mere fiction. It was powerful propaganda that crystallized the anxieties of the ruling class, fueling one of Britain's first major moral panics. Parliament's attempts to control the epidemic were initially clumsy and ineffective. The Gin Act of 1736, which imposed a high license fee on retailers and a heavy duty on the spirit, was a spectacular failure. It was widely flouted, leading to riots and the creation of a massive black market. The law relied on public informers to report illegal sales, but these individuals were often attacked and sometimes murdered by vengeful mobs. The crisis was only brought under control by the more pragmatic Gin Act of 1751. This legislation shifted the focus from the consumer to the producer, making it harder for small-scale distillers to operate while empowering magistrates to regulate retail sales more strictly. By raising the price and restricting the supply, the Act finally curbed the worst excesses of the craze, ending a decades-long social catastrophe that had laid bare the profound inequalities of Georgian London. In the mid-18th century, while gin-sodden poverty and imperial wealth defined the city's extremes, a powerful intellectual culture took hold, personified by the figure of Samuel Johnson. Arriving from Lichfield in 1737, he would come to dominate the capital's literary scene, famously declaring that, "When a man is tired of London, he is tired of life." His London was a city of fierce debate, monumental scholarship, and commercialized intellect, centered on the booming print trade of Fleet Street and its surroundings. Johnson's most significant contribution was his A Dictionary of the English Language, a project of Herculean scale undertaken between 1746 and 1755. Working from a garret at 17 Gough Square with a team of 6 assistants, he single-handedly compiled over 42 zero entries. His great innovation was to illustrate definitions with literary quotations, drawing on a vast reading of English authors since the Elizabethan era. This methodical use of over 114 zero citations to establish precedent and meaning was a landmark in lexicography, standardizing English spelling and usage for the next century and a half. This scholarly world was not a solitary one. In 1764, Johnson co-founded the Club, later the Literary Club, with the painter Sir Joshua Reynolds. Meeting weekly at the Turk's Head Tavern in Soho, this small, exclusive group became the undisputed centre of London's intellectual elite. Its members included the political philosopher Edmund Burke, the playwright Oliver Goldsmith, the actor David Garrick, and the economist Adam Smith. It was in this forum, over dinner and conversation, that the ideas of the British Enlightenment were debated, refined, and disseminated. The club's proceedings were meticulously documented by one of its later members, James Boswell, whose biography of Johnson provides an unparalleled record of the city's conversational life. This entire ecosystem was fueled by the commercial engine of London's print culture. The area around St. Paul's Cathedral, particularly Paternoster Row, was the heart of the bookselling and publishing trade. A new class of professional authors, often living in penury in the area derogatorily known as Grub Street, produced a constant stream of pamphlets, poems, translations, and articles for a growing literate public. Johnson himself began his career as one of these writers for hire. This commercialization of ideas, where intellectual property could be bought and sold, was a defining feature of the era. Johnson's London was therefore a crucible, where scholarship was not just an academic pursuit, but a profession, where conversation in taverns could shape national discourse, and where the relentless industry of the printing press made the city the intellectual capital of the English-speaking world. The intellectual ferment of Johnson's London concealed deep and volatile social fissures, which erupted with catastrophic force in June 1780. The trigger was a minor piece of legislation, the Papists Act of 1778, a tentative step towards Catholic emancipation, intended primarily to allow Roman Catholics to join the army and own land if they swore an oath of allegiance. This modest reform, however, ignited a firestorm of anti-Catholic paranoia, expertly fanned by the eccentric parliamentarian Lord George Gordon and his Protestant Association. On June 20, Gordon led an immense crowd, numbering at least 40,000, to Parliament to present a petition demanding the Act's repeal. The protest rapidly degenerated into violence. The mob, chanting "No Popery," first targeted the chapels of the Sardinian and Bavarian embassies, gutting them and burning their contents in the streets. What began as religious bigotry quickly morphed into a full-scale insurrection against the state itself. The rioters were not a disciplined army, but a coalition of the disenfranchised, apprentices, and criminals who directed their fury at all symbols of authority. Their most audacious act was the storming of Newgate Prison. Using sledgehammers and crowbars, the mob breached the gates, liberated the prisoners, and set the vast stone complex ablaze, creating an inferno visible across the city. The Clink and Fleet prisons were also attacked. The violence became a direct assault on the economic and legal establishment. A determined effort was made to storm the Bank of England, a move that threatened the nation's financial stability, but the institution was successfully defended by soldiers and armed clerks in a pitched battle. The homes of the wealthy and powerful were systematically targeted. The house of the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Mansfield, was famously sacked and burned. His priceless library, one of the finest in England, destroyed in the flames. For nearly a week, London was effectively ruled by the mob. The government's response was paralysed by indecision until King George III personally authorised the use of lethal force. The army moved in to suppress the uprising, leading to street battles across the capital. The final death toll was staggering. An estimated 300 to 700 people were killed, the vast majority being rioters shot by troops or perishing in fires. In the aftermath, over 400 were arrested and 25 were executed. The Gordon riots remain the most destructive in London's history, a brutal testament to the religious intolerance and social rage simmering just beneath the surface of the Enlightenment city. While the old city wrestled with the consequences of riot and rapid commercialization, a new London was taking shape to the west, built not of chaotic necessity, but of aristocratic design. The development of the West End throughout the 18th century was a vast and profitable exercise in urban planning, driven by the great landowning families who sought to create a fashionable enclave far from the noise and industry of the commercial centre. This expansion was facilitated by the leasehold system, a model of speculative development where landowners like the Grosvenor, Bedford, and Portman families did not sell their land outright. Instead, they leased large plots to builders and developers for fixed terms, typically 99 years, dictating the overall layout, architectural style, and quality of the housing to be constructed. This gave the estates immense control over the character of their new developments, ensuring a classical uniformity and long-term financial return. The defining feature of this Georgian expansion was the residential square. These carefully planned spaces, consisting of terraces of elegant townhouses built around a central enclosed garden, became the signature of aristocratic London. Grosvenor Square in Mayfair, laid out in the 1720s on land owned by Sir Richard Grosvenor, became the most prestigious address. It was followed by others like Bedford Square in Bloomsbury, developed from 1775 by the trustees of the Duke of Bedford's estate, which remains one of the best preserved examples of a complete Georgian square. The architectural style was rooted in Palladian principles of symmetry, harmony, and classical proportion. The terraced houses presented a unified facade to the square, often with a central pedimented section to mimic a grand country palace. Uniform sash windows, restrained brickwork, and elegant iron railings created a sense of orderly, rational grandeur. This new urban landscape was designed to accommodate the highly ritualized social life of the aristocracy during the London season. From winter until early summer, wealthy families would migrate from their country estates to their London townhouses to engage in a relentless cycle of balls, assemblies, and formal visits. The squares provided a perfect setting for this life, with the central garden serving as a private, secure space for residents to promenade and socialize. Behind the grand houses, a network of mews provided essential services, housing the stables, carriages, and servants required to maintain an aristocratic lifestyle. This planned, exclusive world stood in stark contrast to the rest of the sprawling metropolis, creating a physical and social geography that permanently separated the centres of commerce from the centres of power and fashion. The elegant squares of the West End and the commercial bustle of the city masked a growing problem of endemic crime, for which 18th century London had no effective solution. Law enforcement was a fragmented and largely amateur affair, reliant on a patchwork of unpaid parish constables and aged, ineffective night watchmen, often lampooned as Charlies. This system was entirely reactive and jurisdictionally bound, incapable of dealing with the organised criminal gangs and highwaymen that plagued the metropolis. The first significant step towards professional policing came not from government policy, but from the initiative of one man at a single address. No, 4 Bow Street, Covent Garden. In 1748, the novelist and playwright Henry Fielding was appointed as a magistrate for Westminster. Appalled by the corruption and ineptitude he witnessed, he began to formalise a small group of dedicated constables funded by government grants in 1749. These men, who soon earned the nickname the Bow Street Runners, were fundamentally different from their predecessors. They were England's first professional, centrally organised police force. Unlike the parish watch, the runners were proactive investigators. When a crime was reported, they would actively pursue leads, gather evidence, and track down suspects across the city, unbound by parish lines. Fielding understood the critical importance of information. He established a system for recording and disseminating descriptions of wanted criminals and stolen goods. By 1773, this evolved into a regular publication, the Hue and Cry, which was distributed across the country, creating an early form of a national criminal database and making it much harder for offenders to simply disappear into another town. After Henry Fielding's death in 1754, his work was continued and greatly expanded by his half-brother Sir John Fielding. Known as the Blind Beak due to his sightlessness, John Fielding's inability to see was compensated by an extraordinary ability to recognize criminals by their voices alone. He further professionalized the force, securing more consistent government funding and establishing the Bow Street Horse Patrol in 1805 to combat the menace of highwaymen on the roads leading into London. He also created a vast archive of criminal records, cross-referencing thousands of offences to identify patterns and career criminals. The Bow Street runners were never a large force, numbering only a few dozen at their peak, but their impact was profound. They demonstrated the effectiveness of a paid, mobile, and intelligence-led approach to policing, proving a concept that would directly inform Sir Robert Peel's creation of the Metropolitan Police a half-century later. By the mid-19th century, London's unprecedented growth had created a sanitary crisis of catastrophic proportions. The River Thames, the city's ancient artery, had become its primary sewer. Hundreds of thousands of cesspits and a network of crumbling, inadequate drains discharged raw human and industrial waste directly into the watercourse. This toxic soup was then drawn back into the city's water supply, creating a perfect cycle for the transmission of waterborne diseases. Successive cholera epidemics, particularly the devastating outbreak of 1854 that killed over 10,000 Londoners, highlighted the lethal state of the river. Yet political inertia prevented any meaningful action. The prevailing scientific theory of the time held that disease was spread by miasma or foul air, a belief that paradoxically both obscured the true cause and intensified the urgency to act when the smell became unbearable. That moment arrived with the exceptionally hot summer of 1858. The heat fermented the sewage in the shallow Thames, creating an overpowering stench that enveloped the entire city in what became known as the Great Stink. The smell was so noxious that it brought the work of the nation to a halt. At the newly rebuilt Houses of Parliament, situated directly on the riverbank, the curtains were soaked in chloride of lime in a futile attempt to mask the odour. The situation became so intolerable that members of Parliament seriously debated relocating the entire government. This direct assault on the nostrils of the nation's lawmakers finally broke the political deadlock. Within a matter of weeks, Parliament rushed through an enabling act, granting the Metropolitan Board of Works and its chief engineer, Joseph Bazalgette, the funds and authority to solve the problem permanently. Bazalgette's solution was a work of engineering genius, staggering in its scale and ambition. He designed a vast, integrated network of 82 miles of underground intercepting sewers running parallel to the Thames. These brick-lined tunnels, some large enough to drive a train through, were designed to intercept the flow from the existing drains before it reached the river, conveying the effluent eastwards using a gentle gradient. Where gravity was insufficient, massive pumping stations, such as the ornate Abbey Mills in the north and Crossness in the south, would lift the sewage to a higher level. The entire system culminated in two outfalls at Beckton and Crossness, far downstream, where the waste would be discharged into the river on the ebb tide and carried out to sea. The project was a monumental undertaking, requiring 318 million bricks and the excavation of 3.5 million cubic yards of earth. Completed in 1875, Bazalgette's sewer system not only ended the Great Stink, but also dramatically reduced the incidence of cholera, proving to be one of the most significant public health advancements in history. The next great transformation of London was driven not by a unified civic plan, but by the chaotic and competitive force of private enterprise. The arrival of the railway in the 19th century was less an organised integration and more a brutal invasion, as powerful, competing railway companies carved paths of iron and steam through the dense urban fabric. Fueled by the speculative frenzy of railway mania in the 1840s, these companies, armed with compulsory purchase powers granted by Acts of Parliament, engaged in a form of mass, legalized demolition. Vast swathes of the city, often densely populated poorer districts, were obliterated to make way for the cuttings, viaducts, and marshalling yards required to bring the iron horse to the capital's edge. This process displaced tens of thousands of people, fundamentally and permanently altering the city's social geography. A crucial decision, made by a royal commission in 1846, profoundly shaped the outcome of this railway invasion. Fearing the congestion and destruction that would result from lines penetrating the historic core, the Commission banned the new railways from entering the City of London or the West End. This act forced the companies to terminate their lines on the periphery, creating what became a great ring of terminal stations around central London. These were not mere transport hubs, they were monumental expressions of corporate power and engineering prowess, cathedrals of the new industrial age. Each terminus was a testament to the ambition of its parent company. Euston, the first mainline station, opened in 1837 for the London and Birmingham Railway, announced its presence with the colossal Euston Arch, a Doric propylaeum of unprecedented scale. This was followed by a succession of ever grander stations. The Great Northern Railway built King's Cross in 1852, its functional elegance designed by Louis Cubitt, defined by two vast arched train sheds. Isambard Kingdom Brunel's Paddington Station for the Great Western Railway, completed in 1854, was a masterpiece of wrought iron and glass construction. The ultimate statement of railway grandeur was St Pancras, opened in 1868. The Midland Railway, a latecomer to London, built William Henry Barlow's single-span train shed, then the largest in the world, fronted by George Gilbert Scott's fantastically ornate Gothic Revival Hotel. These great stations, forming a new perimeter around the capital, became the new gateways to London, funneling unprecedented numbers of people and goods into a city forever remade by steam. The great ring of terminal stations had solved one problem but created another. A city centre throttled by unprecedented levels of horse-drawn traffic. Omnibuses, cabs, and carts clogged the streets, ferrying passengers and goods between the disconnected termini and the commercial heart of the city. The solution to this surface-level paralysis came from beneath the ground, championed by Charles Pearson, a solicitor for the City of London Corporation. Pearson envisioned a subterranean railway not only to relieve the chronic congestion, but as a tool for social improvement, allowing the working classes to move from unsanitary central slums to healthier, more affordable suburbs. Despite widespread public ridicule and immense technical challenges, Pearson's persistent lobbying eventually led to the formation of the Metropolitan Railway Company, which received parliamentary approval in 1854. The engineering task was monumental and entirely without precedent. The chosen construction method was cut and cover, a brutally disruptive process. A massive trench, typically 33 feet wide and 20 feet deep, was excavated along the line of existing thoroughfares like the Marylebone and Euston roads. Navigating the subterranean chaos of London's infrastructure was a constant challenge, as navvies had to divert ancient sewers, gas mains, and water pipes. Entire buildings had their foundations shored up as the trench passed by. Once the trench was dug, brick walls were built on either side, tracks were laid at the bottom, and a vast brick arch was constructed overhead to form the tunnel roof. The trench was then backfilled, and the road surface was reinstated on top. For years, major London arteries were transformed into vast open construction sites, causing chaos for residents and businesses. The technology of the railway itself was a compromise. The line was built for broad-gauge trains, but a dispute with the Great Western Railway forced a last-minute addition of a third rail to also accommodate standard-gauge stock. The locomotives were steam-powered, a significant problem for a subterranean system. Special engines designed by Daniel Gooch and Robert Stephenson were fitted with condensing apparatus to turn exhaust steam back into water. but this did little to alleviate the sulphurous smoke and fumes that filled the tunnels and stations. On January 10th, 1863, the Metropolitan Railway opened, running for 3.5 miles between Paddington and Farringdon Street. It was an immediate, resounding success, carrying over 38,000 passengers on its first day, and proving the viability of a new form of urban transport that would be copied by cities across the globe. In the middle of the 19th century, Britain stood at the apex of its industrial and imperial power, a position its leaders were keen to display to the world. The concept for a grand international showcase, the great exhibition of the works of industry of all nations, was championed by Prince Albert, the Prince Consort, and the civil servant Henry Cole. It was intended as a celebration of progress, a peaceful festival of commerce and invention that would cement London's status as the global capital of manufacturing and trade. The Royal Commission appointed to oversee the project launched a design competition for a temporary building to be erected in Hyde Park, but the 245 official entries were deemed too costly, too permanent, or too aesthetically conventional. The Commission's own brick-built design was met with public outcry, threatening the entire enterprise. The solution came from Joseph Paxton, a gardener and architect who had extensive experience designing innovative glass houses for the Duke of Devonshire. His revolutionary design, famously sketched on blotting paper during a railway board meeting, was for a colossal yet elegant structure made entirely from prefabricated cast iron and vast panes of newly affordable plate glass. This modular approach was the key to its feasibility. Standardized components, iron girders, columns and glass panels were mass-produced in factories across the Midlands and transported to London by rail. On site, these parts were assembled with remarkable speed and precision, allowing the immense building to be erected in just 9 months. The resulting structure, dubbed the Crystal Palace by the magazine Punch, was a marvel of Victorian engineering, covering 19 acres and enclosing fully grown elm trees within its central transept. Opening on May 1851, the Great Exhibition was an unparalleled success. Inside the light-filled hall, over 100 objects were displayed by more than 14 exhibitors, half from Britain and its empire, the other half from foreign nations. Exhibits ranged from the colossal Koh-i-Noor diamond to American McCormick reaping machines, intricate French silks, and powerful British steam engines. Over 6 million people, equivalent to a third of the entire population of Britain, visited the exhibition before it closed in October. The event generated a substantial profit of 186, a sum that Prince Albert ensured was used to establish a permanent cultural and educational precinct in South Kensington, leading to the foundation of the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Science Museum, and the Natural History Museum. The Crystal Palace itself was later dismantled and rebuilt on an even grander scale in Sydenham, South London, a lasting monument to a moment of supreme national confidence. The same industrial dynamism that powered the Great Exhibition also fueled an unprecedented and uncontrolled expansion of London's population, creating a metropolitan reality far removed from the polished showcases of Hyde Park. For hundreds of thousands, the city was not a testament to progress, but a landscape of immense hardship. This was the world documented by social investigators and immortalized by the novelist Charles Dickens, a city of stark, unforgiving contrasts. The engine of this social crisis was relentless migration, as people from across Britain and Ireland poured into the capital seeking work, overwhelming an ancient infrastructure utterly unprepared for their arrival. They crowded into vast, densely packed slums known as rookeries, districts like St. Giles and Jacob's Island, where families numbering a dozen or more would inhabit a single, unventilated room. Sanitation in these areas was non-existent. Domestic waste and human effluent were thrown into shared courtyards or flowed through open ditches in the unpaved streets. With no reliable source of clean water, residents often drank directly from a Thames river, contaminated by industrial pollutants and raw sewage. leading to devastating and recurrent outbreaks of waterborne diseases like cholera, which swept through the slums in deadly epidemics. For those who fell into absolute destitution, the state's response was the institution of the workhouse, reshaped by the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834. This system was built on the principle of less eligibility, ensuring that conditions inside were deliberately harsher than those of the poorest independent labourer outside. It was a system designed to deter, not to aid. Families were forcibly separated upon entry, and inmates were subjected to monotonous, often pointless labour, such as picking oakum or breaking stones. This world of poverty was captured with journalistic precision by Henry Mayhew in his exhaustive study, London Labour and the London Poor, which systematically categorised the precarious lives of street sellers, scavengers, and casual labourers. It was Charles Dickens, however, who translated these grim statistics into a powerful social narrative. Through his novels and his work as a journalist, particularly in his magazine Household Words, Dickens exposed the realities of the workhouse, the failures of the legal system, and the plight of the urban poor to a vast middle-class readership. His work was not mere fiction. It was a form of social commentary that shone a light into the darkest corners of the imperial capital, revealing the profound human cost that underpinned its progress and prosperity. In the autumn of 1888, the endemic poverty of London's East End was overshadowed by a new and visceral form of terror. Within the densely populated and poorly lit warren of streets that constituted Whitechapel and Spitalfields, a single, unidentified individual embarked on a series of brutal killings that would create a lasting legend. The murderer, who became known to the world as Jack the Ripper, targeted impoverished women working as casual prostitutes, their vulnerable circumstances making them easy prey in the district's dark alleyways and transient lodging houses. Between August and November of that year, a sequence of 5 murders, known as the Canonical Five, were attributed to this single figure, creating a climate of intense fear and pressuring the authorities to their absolute limit. The victims, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, shared a similar profile of destitution. The nature of their deaths, however, was shockingly unique and consistent. In each case, the victim's throat was severed by 1 or 2 deep incisions. This was followed by extensive and precise post-mortem mutilation, typically involving the removal of internal organs. The surgical knowledge suggested by the wounds led investigators to suspect the killer possessed some degree of anatomical or medical training, a detail that amplified public horror. The final victim, Mary Jane Kelly, was subjected to an almost unimaginable level of mutilation within the relative privacy of her rented room, an act that marked the grisly climax of the killing spree. The investigation fell to the Metropolitan Police's H Division, who found themselves overwhelmed by the unprecedented nature of the crimes and the chaotic environment of Whitechapel. They conducted exhaustive house-to-house inquiries, interviewed hundreds of residents, and detained numerous suspects, but made no definitive progress. The case also marked a turning point in public communication. The Central News Agency received a letter, famously beginning "Dear Boss," and signed Jack the Ripper, which, along with other communications, was published by an increasingly sensationalist press, creating a media frenzy that both fueled public panic and cemented the killer's infamous name. After the horrific murder of Mary Jane Kelly on November 9th, 1888, the killings abruptly ceased. The perpetrator was never identified, and the case remains one of the most profound unsolved mysteries in criminal history, a dark episode that starkly exposed the brutal realities of life and death in the shadows of the imperial capital. The late 19th century witnessed a fundamental reordering of London's physical and social geography, driven by forces that pushed its population outwards from the densely packed industrial core. While the Great Railway to Minnie had connected London to the nation, it was the subsequent proliferation of a dense network of suburban and commuter lines that truly reshaped the city. Legislation proved to be a powerful catalyst. The Cheap Trains Act of 1883 compelled railway companies to provide affordable workmen's fares, a policy that for the first time made it economically feasible for skilled labourers and the lower middle classes to live miles from their place of work. This act, coupled with the relentless expansion of branch lines and the electrification of the burgeoning underground system, unlocked vast tracts of formerly rural land in the surrounding counties of Middlesex, Essex, Surrey, and Kent for speculative development. This outward migration was financed by the rise of a new and powerful institution, the Building Society. By providing accessible mortgages to a growing class of clerks, teachers, and artisans, these societies fueled an explosion in private home ownership. In response, speculative builders purchased large agricultural estates adjacent to newly opened railway stations and began the mass construction of housing. The architectural product of this era was the ubiquitous brick-built terraced or semi-detached house, often featuring standardized elements like bay windows, small front gardens, and private rear yards. This model of housing represented a powerful aspirational ideal, a domestic sanctuary that offered privacy, sanitation, and a tangible escape from the perceived moral and physical contamination of the inner-city slums. The result was the creation of a vast, socially stratified suburban landscape. The new communities were often homogeneous, with different developments and railway lines explicitly marketed to specific income levels. The Metropolitan Railway, for instance, famously promoted its expansion into Buckinghamshire under the brand Metroland, cultivating an image of idyllic middle-class country living. This mass decentralization created the modern commuter lifestyle, institutionalizing the daily journey between a residential suburb and a central workplace. For millions, life became defined by a sharp separation between the public, masculine sphere of the city office and the private, feminized domain of the suburban home. By the turn of the 20th century, the unstoppable growth of the suburbs had irrevocably transformed the capital, creating a sprawling metropolis whose true boundaries were no longer defined by ancient walls, but by the reach of its railway timetables. As the Edwardian era dawned, London stood as the undisputed capital of a global empire, a city of immense wealth and political power. Yet for over half its population, access to that power was barred by law. The campaign for women's suffrage, long pursued through constitutional means by organizations like the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, entered a new and confrontational phase with the founding of the Women's Social and Political Union WSPU in 1903. Under the leadership of Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters Christabel and Sylvia, the WSPU adopted the motto, "Deeds, not words," shifting the struggle from the polite confines of committee rooms directly onto the streets of the capital. London became the primary theatre for the WSPU's campaign of escalating civil disobedience. Initially, their actions involved disrupting political meetings and organising mass rallies in places like Hyde Park and Trafalgar Square. When these tactics failed to move the Liberal government under H.H. Asquith, their methods became explicitly militant. From 1912 onwards, a coordinated campaign of property damage began, targeting symbols of commerce and the state. Plate glass windows of prominent shops on Oxford Street were systematically smashed, pillar boxes were set alight with chemical compounds, and telegraph wires were severed to disrupt communications. These acts were calculated to attack the economic and administrative infrastructure of the patriarchal state, forcing the issue of female enfranchisement into the national consciousness in a way that peaceful lobbying never had. The state's response was severe. Hundreds of suffragettes were arrested and imprisoned, with many held in London's Holloway prison. There, they adopted the political weapon of the hunger strike, refusing food to protest their classification as common criminals rather than political prisoners. The authorities retaliated with the brutal and medically dangerous procedure of forcible feeding, a practice that generated considerable public sympathy for the women's cause. In 1913, the government passed the Prisoners' Temporary Discharge for Ill Health Act, derisively known as the Cat and Mouse Act, which allowed them to release weakened hunger strikers and rearrest them once they had recovered. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 brought an abrupt halt to the militant campaign, as the WSPU leadership channeled its energies into supporting the war effort. The immense contribution of women to the nation's industry and workforce during the conflict fundamentally altered political perceptions. In 1918, with the passage of the Representation of the People Act, the goal was partially achieved, granting the vote to property-owning women over the age of 30, a direct consequence of a struggle that had irrevocably transformed the political landscape of the capital. The outbreak of the First World War in August 1914 introduced London to a form of warfare for which it was entirely unprepared. For the first time in its long history, the civilian population became a direct and strategic target, as Germany sought to break British morale through a campaign of aerial bombardment. This new threat began in earnest on the night of May 31, 1915, with the arrival of the first German Zeppelin airship, the LZ-38. These colossal hydrogen-filled dirigibles, initially immune to interception by rudimentary aircraft and anti-aircraft fire, brought a unique psychological terror. Their nocturnal raids, announced by the low thrum of their engines, inflicted damage that was often random yet deadly, earning them the moniker baby killers in the popular press after civilian casualties mounted. By 1917, German strategy evolved. The vulnerable Zeppelins were largely replaced by formations of heavier-than-air Gotha G4 bombers, which were faster, more maneuverable, and capable of conducting daylight raids. A raid on June 13, 1917, proved particularly devastating when a bomb struck the Upper North Street School in Poplar, killing 18 children and creating a wave of public outrage that forced a complete overhaul of the capital's air defenses. In response, the city was plunged into its first comprehensive blackouts, with streetlights extinguished and residents ordered to cover their windows. The deep tunnels of the underground system were repurposed as makeshift air raid shelters, providing sanctuary for thousands during the nightly alerts. This pressure from the air was a primary catalyst for a major military reorganization. In April 1918, the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Air Service were merged to form the world's first independent air force, the Royal Air Force, tasked specifically with defending the nation's airspace. The armistice in 1918 ended the immediate threat, but the war left indelible scars on the city's psyche and demanded new forms of public commemoration. In 1919, a temporary wood and plaster structure, the Cenotaph, designed by Edwin Lutyens, was erected in Whitehall as a saluting point for a victory parade. Its stark, non-denominational design resonated so powerfully with the public's need for a focal point of collective grief that it was rebuilt in Portland stone the following year. On November 11, 1920, this sense of solemn remembrance was further concretized with the burial of the unknown warrior in Westminster Abbey. The body, chosen at random from the battlefields of France, was interred with the highest state honors, a symbolic act that granted every bereaved family without a grave a place to mourn their own personal loss within the nation's most sacred space. The lessons learned from the aerial bombardments of the Great War proved to be a mere prelude to the trial by fire that awaited London 2 decades later. Following the fall of France in the summer of 1940, the capital found itself on the front line of the Second World War. The German Luftwaffe's strategic pivot from targeting RAF airfields to a sustained assault on London itself began on September 7, 1940, a day that would become known as Black Saturday. For 57 consecutive nights, and then intermittently until May 1941, the city endured a relentless bombing campaign intended to shatter its industrial capacity and destroy civilian morale. This was the Blitz. The methodology of the assault was systematic. Each raid typically began with the dropping of high explosive bombs designed to rupture water mains and create obstacles for emergency services. This was immediately followed by waves of incendiary devices, which could then ignite uncontrollable fires in the absence of an effective response. The initial focus of the bombardment was the Port of London, with the docks and warehouses of the East End suffering catastrophic damage. The attack soon became indiscriminate, however, with residential areas across the capital experiencing the nightly terror of the air raid siren. The civilian response was organized and institutionalized on a scale never seen before. Pre-distributed Anderson shelters, constructed from corrugated iron and buried in gardens, provided protection from shrapnel, while indoor Morrison shelters offered a reinforced refuge within the home. The city's underground stations were spontaneously occupied as deep-level shelters, eventually becoming officially sanctioned and equipped to house tens of thousands. The defense of the city fell not only to the military, but to a vast network of civilian organizations. Air raid precautions, ARP wardens, enforced the blackout, monitored for gas attacks, and guided people to safety. The Auxiliary Fire Service, AFS, a volunteer force, battled the resulting infernos, their efforts reaching a climax on the night of December 29th, 1940. This raid, targeting the historic city of London with thousands of incendiaries, created a firestorm that became known as the Second Great Fire of London. Amid the devastation, a concentrated effort successfully saved St. Paul's Cathedral, a potent symbol of national defiance. By the end of the main Blitz in May 1941, over 20 Londoners had been killed and more than 1 million houses had been destroyed or damaged. Yet, the primary German objective had failed. The city's infrastructure, though battered, continued to function, and the collective will of its inhabitants, forged into the Blitz spirit, remained unbroken. The end of the Second World War left London a city profoundly scarred, not only by the physical voids of its bomb sites, but by years of austerity and rationing that continued long after the fighting stopped. The immediate post-war period was one of ambitious, state-led reconstruction, guided by visionary but rigidly controlled planning. The blueprint for this new metropolis was the Abercrombie Plan of 1944, a comprehensive scheme that sought to rationalize the city's chaotic growth by establishing a restraining green belt and decanting populations into newly conceived satellite towns. This era of rebuilding was architecturally defined by brutalism, a style that favored raw concrete and uncompromising geometric forms, exemplified by the construction of the Royal Festival Hall for the 1951 Festival of Britain, an event specifically designed to showcase a modern, forward-looking nation rising from the rubble. By the early 1960s, a generation born into this grey post-war world was coming of age. Fueled by post-austerity economic prosperity and full employment, a new youth-driven consumer culture erupted, transforming London into the epicenter of a global cultural phenomenon. This was Swinging London, a term popularized by a 1966 Time magazine cover story. The movement's primary hubs were Carnaby Street in Soho and the King's Road in Chelsea, which became showcases for a radical departure in fashion. Boutiques, rather than traditional department stores, became the arbiters of style, with designers like Mary Quant pioneering the mini-skirt, a garment that captured the era's spirit of liberation and rebellion against the established social order. This cultural revolution was amplified by a musical explosion. London-based bands like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and The Who achieved international stardom, their sound defining the era and drawing creative individuals from around the world to the city's vibrant club scene. The social landscape was concurrently reshaped by the relaxation of censorship in theatre and film, and the rise of a potent satirical movement led by publications like Private Eye, which lampooned the very establishment figures who had guided the nation through the war. The city's identity was fundamentally reinvented. The stoic, resilient capital of the Blitz gave way to an international hub of fashion, music, and social change, a dynamic crucible where the rigid certainties of the past were decisively and colourfully overthrown by the aspirations of a new generation. The cultural vibrancy of the 1960s gave way to an era of profound economic restructuring and social tension. The 1970s witnessed the terminal decline of London's traditional industrial base, as the upstream docks, once the heart of a global maritime empire, fell silent in the face of containerization and a shift in global trade routes. This deindustrialization precipitated a period of urban decay and high unemployment, creating social frictions that culminated in events such as the 1981 Brixton riots, which exposed deep-seated racial and economic divisions within the metropolis. A decisive moment of reinvention arrived on October 27, 1986, with the deregulation of the financial markets, an event known as the Big Bang. This single act dismantled the old, club-like structures of the City of London, opening it to international competition and electronic trading, and transforming it into the engine of a new, globalized service economy. This financial revolution found its physical expression in a radical architectural transformation. The once low-rise city skyline began to ascend, first with the development of Canary Wharf in the derelict Docklands, and later with a new generation of iconic skyscrapers that redefined the capital's profile. Structures like the Lloyd's Building, with its services placed unconventionally on the exterior, and later the Gherkin and the Shard, became symbols of London's restored status as a world financial centre. Concurrently, the city's demographic fabric was being rewoven by new patterns of global migration. The post-war arrival of Commonwealth citizens from the Caribbean, the Indian subcontinent, and Africa established multicultural communities that permanently reshaped London's cultural landscape, introducing new cuisines, music, and traditions, most visibly celebrated in the annual Notting Hill Carnival. The city's governance also underwent a fundamental shift. The abolition of the Greater London Council in 1986 was reversed with the creation of the Greater London Authority in 2000, establishing a directly elected mayor with strategic oversight of transport, policing, and economic development for the first time. This political evolution was matched by vast infrastructure projects designed to support a modern megacity, including the Jubilee Line extension and the preparations for the 2012 Olympic Games, which catalysed the regeneration of entire districts in East London. The capital had once again remade itself, no longer the heart of a territorial empire, but a primary node in a globalised network of finance, culture, and migration, a city defined not by a static identity, but by its capacity for perpetual and dynamic change.